Welcome, dear listener, to a journey through shadows and secrets. Tonight, we'll travel together through the hidden history of a small Indiana town, exploring the ordinary streets and extraordinary mysteries of Hawkins. As you settle into your comfortable space, let the gentle flow of this timeline carry you into peaceful dreams. Every decade holds its own darkness, its own stories waiting to be told. So let's start at the very beginning, long before laboratories and monsters, when this land knew only ancient rhythms. In the centuries before anyone called it Hawkins, long before Indiana became a state, the land where the town now stands held its own secrets. The rolling hills of what would become Roane County stretched beneath endless skies, covered in dense hardwood forests where oak and maple grew for centuries undisturbed. The Miami and Potawatomi peoples knew these lands intimately, following seasonal patterns that connected them to every stream and clearing. They understood the forests held power, that certain places felt different, that the ground itself possessed qualities not immediately visible. The limestone beneath this particular corner of Indiana created natural formations that would prove significant centuries later. Underground caverns formed over millennia, water-carving channels through porous rock, creating hidden spaces that branched and twisted like veins beneath the surface. These geological features made the area ideal for quarrying, but they also created something else, pockets of darkness that existed independent of human awareness, places where sound behaved strangely and compass needles sometimes wavered. French explorers passed through in the late 1600s, followed by British surveyors, but permanent European settlement came slowly to this interior region. The land resisted easy categorization, too forested for immediate farming, too isolated for convenient trade. The indigenous peoples maintained presence here longer than in more accessible areas, but by the late 18th century, pressure from westward expansion had displaced most native populations from what would become Indiana Territory. The land waited patiently, its limestone bones holding spaces that light would never reach, preparing for purposes no one could yet imagine. As American settlement pushed westward in the early 19th century, this particular corner of Indiana began attracting a different kind of attention. The town of Hawkins came into being in 1801 when Colonel Samuel Hawkins, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, claimed land along the eastern edge of what would become Roane County. Hawkins chose this location for practical reasons. The forests promised timber for building and fuel. The streams provided water and potential mill power. Most importantly, exposed limestone outcroppings suggested quarrying opportunities that could provide both local building material and exportable goods. Colonel Hawkins brought his family and convinced several fellow veterans to join him in establishing a settlement. The first winter tested their resolve, isolated as they were from established supply routes, but they endured. By 1803, the settlement had grown to include 12 families, a general store, and a mill. The town's layout followed typical frontier patterns: a central square where the general store and eventual courthouse would stand, radiating streets following the easiest terrain, and individual claims spreading outward into surrounding farmland. The quarry operations began modestly in 1805. Local craftsmen discovered the limestone's quality made it valuable for construction, its pale colour and fine grain producing attractive, durable building material. As more families arrived, the quarries expanded, providing employment beyond farming and establishing Hawkins' economic foundation. The town incorporated officially in 1820, adopting its founder's name and establishing basic governmental structures that would persist for generations. The community developed slowly but steadily through the 1820s and 1830s. A schoolhouse appeared in 1822, initially serving 23 children. Churches followed, first Methodist in 1825, then Baptist in 1831. The town square evolved from muddy commons to organised marketplace, with wooden buildings replacing initial log structures. By 1840, Hawkins boasted a population of approximately 400, large enough to support specialized trades, blacksmiths, tailors, and cobblers, but small enough that everyone knew everyone's business. By the mid-1800s, Hawkins had established itself as a modest but stable community, its quarries providing limestone for buildings across Indiana, its farms feeding growing populations, its future seemingly predictable and ordinary. The Civil War years tested Hawkins as they tested all American communities, but the town's true trials lay decades in the future. The years between 1861 and 1900 saw Hawkins transform from frontier settlement to established American town, its rhythms following the nation's larger patterns. When war came in 1861, Hawkins contributed its share of soldiers to Union forces. 63 men from the town and surrounding farms enlisted, serving primarily in Indiana infantry regiments. 14 never returned, their names eventually inscribed on a memorial stone in the town square that would stand for more than a century. The post-war decades brought industrialization's gradual reach to rural Indiana. The railroad arrived in Hawkins in 1873, connecting the town to larger markets and transforming its economic possibilities. The quarries expanded dramatically with reliable transportation, shipping limestone to growing cities throughout the Midwest. New businesses appeared along the commercial district surrounding the square. A proper bank opened in 1875, replacing informal lending arrangements. The general store faced competition from specialized shops, a dedicated hardware store, a druggist, a milliner. Downtown Hawkins took recognizable shape during these years. Brick buildings replaced wooden structures along Main Street. The town invested in sidewalks, street lamps powered first by gas and later by electricity. A town hall constructed in 1887 provided space for government offices, public meetings, and occasional social gatherings. The high school, built in 1895, represented the community's commitment to education beyond elementary grades, serving students from throughout the county. Key families established themselves during this period, names that would persist through generations. The Wheelers arrived in 1882, establishing a successful legal practice. The Sinclairs opened a hardware store in 1889 that would operate continuously for nearly a century. These families, along with the Hollands, the Carvers, and others, formed Hawkins' social and economic backbone, intermarrying, serving on town boards, and maintaining the community's character through changing times. The turn of the century brought prosperity to Hawkins. The quarries employed hundreds, their operations expanding into multiple sites throughout the area. Agriculture remained vital, with surrounding farms producing corn, wheat, and livestock for regional markets. The town's population reached 1,500 by 1900, large enough to support amenities like a library, established in 1898 through donations from prominent families, and a small hospital, founded in 1902 after a typhoid outbreak, revealed the need for organized medical care. World War I touched Hawkins more distantly than the Civil War had. 47 men served, 7 died overseas, their sacrifice commemorated alongside earlier generations. The war brought economic benefits through increased demand for agricultural products and building materials, but it also introduced Hawkins to broader national concerns. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 killed 32 residents in 3 months, overwhelming the hospital and creating community trauma that lingered for years. The 1920s brought mixed fortunes, prohibition, complicated social life, and created opportunities for illegal activity that had been rare in Hawkins' law-abiding history. The quarries faced economic pressure from changing construction methods and increased competition. Some operations closed, consolidating into fewer, larger concerns. Still, the decade maintained general prosperity. The downtown thrived, farms remained productive, and younger generations mostly stayed rather than joining migrations to cities. The Great Depression devastated Hawkins as it devastated agricultural communities nationwide. The quarries reduced operations drastically, laying off workers. Farms failed when crop prices collapsed. The bank closed in 1932, wiping out savings for dozens of families. Federal relief programs eventually provided some support, work projects, improving roads and public buildings, but the 1930s remained a decade of privation and anxiety. By 1940, Hawkins seemed completely unremarkable, a town where everyone knew everyone, where nothing unexpected ever happened, where the greatest excitement was Friday night basketball games and the annual 4th of July parade. But World War II would bring changes to Hawkins that few small towns experienced, transformations hidden behind chain-link fences and classified documents. The Second World War reached Hawkins in 1942, not through draft notices alone, but through a different kind of mobilization, one that would reshape the town's destiny forever. As young men departed for military service, and families adjusted to wartime rationing and anxiety, federal representatives arrived in Hawkins, conducting surveys that seemed routine but served purposes no civilian understood. The Manhattan Project, America's secret effort to develop atomic weapons, required isolated locations for various research and production facilities. While the main laboratories operated in Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, dozens of smaller sites supported specific aspects of the program. Hawkins attracted attention for several reasons. Its isolation from major population centers provided security advantages. The existing quarry infrastructure suggested possibilities for underground construction. The geology, that limestone honeycomb beneath the surface, offered natural spaces that could be expanded and utilized. Most importantly, the town's modest size and economic vulnerability made it amenable to federal intervention. Government representatives approached town leaders in late 1942 with vague explanations about war production facilities. They purchased substantial acreage on the northeast edge of town, including exhausted quarry sites whose commercial value had diminished. Construction began in early 1943, employing hundreds of local workers who signed non-disclosure agreements about projects they didn't fully understand. The facility appeared unremarkable from outside, industrial buildings surrounded by standard fencing, nothing suggesting the underground excavation extending deep into the limestone beneath. The work continued through war's end and beyond, puzzling some residents, but welcomed by most for the employment and economic activity it generated. The government's presence became normalized, accepted as permanent fact rather than temporary wartime measure. Officials explained the facility's purpose as energy research, testing new power generation methods that could transform American infrastructure. This cover story, plausible in an era of rapid technological advancement, satisfied most questions. The town's relationship with the federal government evolved during these years. Hawkins gained economic stability through government contracts and civilian employee salaries. Infrastructure improvements followed federal investment, better roads, upgraded utilities, expanded services. The town learned to accommodate security requirements, checkpoints on certain roads, restricted areas marked with warning signs, official requests to avoid asking too many questions about classified work. The war ended in 1945, but the government's presence in Hawkins did not. Quietly, efficiently, foundations were being laid for research that would continue long after victory celebrations faded into memory. As the 1950s began, and America embraced prosperity and normalcy beneath Hawkins, something else was beginning. In 1953, the United States Department of Energy officially broke ground on what would be called Hawkins National Laboratory, a facility dedicated, according to public statements, to experimental research into emerging technologies and energy solutions. The lab's establishment marked a transition from wartime secrecy to Cold War's permanent security state, where classified research became normalized feature of American scientific landscape. The facility's physical expansion during the early 1950s transformed the modest wartime installation into a proper research complex. Above ground, clean modernist buildings projected scientific authority. Below ground, the true scope revealed itself. The existing quarry tunnels were systematically expanded, creating underground levels that eventually extended several hundred feet into the limestone. These subterranean spaces, invisible from outside, would house the lab's most sensitive programs, their existence known only to those with appropriate clearances. Dr. Martin Brenner arrived in Hawkins in 1953, appointed as the laboratory's deputy director and quickly becoming its most influential figure. Brenner brought impressive credentials, advanced degrees from prestigious universities, published research in psychology and neuroscience, military service during the war, conducting studies that remained classified. His academic brilliance was undeniable, his ethical flexibility less publicly acknowledged. Brenner saw human potential as raw material for scientific advancement, a perspective that would shape everything the lab became. The laboratory's stated mission focused on energy research, nuclear power applications, experimental reactor designs, and advanced materials testing. This public-facing work was real, producing genuine research that justified the facility's existence and budget. Scientists and technicians working on these conventional projects believed they understood the lab's purpose. They processed data, maintained equipment, and published papers that contributed incrementally to scientific knowledge, never suspecting what occurred in restricted sections they couldn't access. The classified programs pursued different goals entirely. Brenner's psychological warfare division explored human consciousness as potential weapon. Could minds be read? Could thoughts be influenced remotely? Could individuals be trained to access information through psychic means, rather than conventional espionage? These questions, considered fringe science by mainstream researchers, received serious funding within Cold War's paranoid urgency. If the Soviets were researching such capabilities, Americans needed countermeasures, at minimum, offensive applications ideally. The lab's connection to Project MKUltra, the CIA's infamous mind control program, began in the mid-1950s. Brenner's facility became one of numerous sites conducting research under MKUltra's umbrella, receiving funding and subjects through channels that avoided scrutiny. The experiments started conventionally enough: psychological testing, hypnosis studies, sensory deprivation trials. But Brenner's ambitions extended beyond documenting responses. He wanted to create capabilities, to manufacture psychic abilities rather than simply testing whether they existed naturally. Security infrastructure surrounded the laboratory like layers of an onion. The outer fence kept casual trespassers away. Interior checkpoints verified identities and clearance levels. The underground sections required special authorization, with access restricted to personnel whose names appeared on short, carefully maintained lists. Communication protocols prevented information from spreading beyond approved channels. Employees learned to speak vaguely about their work, to deflect questions from family and friends, to accept that portions of their workplace remained permanently off-limits. The town's relationship with the laboratory involved a complicated mixture of pride, curiosity, and acceptance. The lab employed several hundred people by the late 1950s, providing good salaries and stable careers. It attracted educated professionals who might otherwise have left small-town Indiana for urban opportunities. The economic benefits extended throughout Hawkins, increased tax revenue, supported local businesses, and funded civic improvements. Most residents learned not to ask too many questions, accepting the lab as Hawkins' defining feature, its claim to importance beyond agriculture and limestone. By 1958, Hawkins National Laboratory stood complete, its clean white exterior hiding research that pushed the boundaries of ethics and science, its underground levels reaching into depths both literal and metaphorical that would take decades to fully understand. While the lab's exterior projects studied conventional energy and technology, its classified programs pursued something far more unusual, something that began with a single question. Could the human mind access other dimensions? The classified programs at Hawkins' lab began modestly in the late 1950s with psychological testing and sensory deprivation experiments that seemed initially within the bounds of conventional research. Brenner recruited test subjects through methods that evolved from ethical to exploitative. Early volunteers participated willingly, enticed by payments and assurances their contributions served national security. These initial subjects underwent standard psychological batteries, personality assessments, cognitive testing, intelligence measures. Sensory deprivation became Brenner's preferred experimental environment. Subjects floated in darkness, suspended in temperature-controlled salt water that eliminated tactile sensations, wearing hoods that blocked sight and muffled sound. In this void, stripped of normal sensory input, consciousness behaved differently. Some subjects experienced hallucinations, vivid visions disconnected from external reality. Others reported out-of-body sensations, feeling their awareness separate from physical location. A few demonstrated what seemed like genuine extrasensory perception, describing events or locations they couldn't possibly know through conventional means. These occasional successes, however difficult to verify rigorously, convinced Brenner that human consciousness possessed untapped potential. His research proposal suggested that psychic abilities existed in rudimentary form within many individuals, requiring only proper training and enhancement to manifest reliably. The proposal received funding despite skepticism from oversight committees. Cold War paranoia made decision-makers willing to explore any potential advantage, however scientifically questionable. The experiments intensified through the 1960s. Brenner's recruitment methods became less scrupulous. Subjects were drawn from vulnerable populations, prisoners offered sentence reductions, psychiatric patients promised treatment, desperate individuals needing money. The informed consent process that supposedly governed human experimentation became perfunctory. Subjects signed forms without truly understanding what they were volunteering for. The experiments themselves grew more aggressive, longer isolation periods, addition of psychoactive compounds to enhance suggestibility, psychological manipulation to break down normal mental defenses. Connection to CIA's Project MKUltra meant Brenner's work existed within broader network of questionable research. Multiple facilities across the country conducted similar experiments, testing LSD's potential for interrogation, exploring hypnosis for programming assassins, documenting how far human minds could be pushed before breaking permanently. The oversight was minimal, the documentation often destroyed, the ethical violations systematic and deliberate. Brenner's installation at Hawkins represented neither the worst nor the most illegal of these programs, but it pursued its goals with particular single-mindedness. Terry Ives arrived at Hawkins' lab in 1969. A college student at nearby university, she responded to an advertisement seeking paid volunteers for psychological studies. The payment was generous enough to help with tuition and living expenses. The initial sessions seemed harmless, answering questionnaires, undergoing physical examinations, spending time in sensory deprivation tanks, while researchers monitored her responses. Terry demonstrated unusual susceptibility to the isolation experience, reporting vivid visions and seeming to access information she shouldn't possess. Brenner recognized her potential immediately. He moved Terry into more intensive study phase, increasing her exposure to sensory deprivation, adding experimental compounds to her protocol, pushing her toward experiences that transcended normal consciousness. Terry believed she was contributing to scientific knowledge, advancing understanding of human potential. She didn't realize she was being deliberately altered, her brain chemistry modified, her perceptions rewired. When she became pregnant in late 1969, she didn't immediately connect her condition to the experiments, but Brenner understood the implications perfectly. Jane Ives was born in 1971, delivered in the laboratory's medical facilities rather than conventional hospital. Brenner had theorized that experimental compounds administered during pregnancy might enhance fetal neural development, potentially creating psychic abilities from birth rather than requiring years of training. Terry's exposure to the sensory deprivation and enhancement protocols during pregnancy made her daughter a test case for these theories. Immediately after birth, Brenner fabricated a miscarriage story and took the infant into lab custody, preventing Terry from learning her child had survived. The girl taken from her mother and renamed 11 would become the lab's greatest success and, ultimately, its destroyer. But those outcomes lay years in the future. Throughout the 1970s, as Hawkins Above Ground celebrated America's bicentennial and struggled through economic uncertainty, beneath the surface, Brenner's program raised children whose gifts defied natural law. The Classified Numbers program represented Brenner's ultimate ambition, creating psychic abilities rather than hoping to find them naturally. Jane Ives, designated Subject 11, became the program's centerpiece, but she was neither the first nor the only child in Brenner's custody. The program's origins trace back to the late 1960s, when Brenner's experiments with adult subjects had produced inconsistent results. He theorized that psychic abilities required development during childhood, when neural pathways remained plastic and suggestible. Adults brought established mental frameworks that resisted the psychological manipulation necessary for extraordinary abilities. Children offered blank slates, minds that could be shaped towards specific outcomes through proper conditioning. Subject 1, later known as Henry Creel, had preceded all others. Brenner discovered him in 1959, a boy who already possessed natural psychic abilities of remarkable power. Henry's family had experienced tragedy, his mother and sister killed in apparent murder-suicide that Henry himself had caused through telekinetic rage. Brenner recognized the boy's potential and convinced authorities to place Henry in his custody rather than psychiatric institution. For nearly 20 years, Henry served as Brenner's prototype, demonstrating what enhanced abilities could achieve while teaching Brenner how to cultivate similar powers in others. The systematic program began in the early 1970s. Brenner acquired additional subjects through methods even more ethically questionable than Terry Ives' deception. Some children were taken from parents deemed problematic, mothers like Terry, who discovered their babies survived and tried to intervene. Others came from orphanages or foster systems, children whose disappearance wouldn't generate sustained investigation. A few were products of the experimental breeding program, infants born to women who'd participated in enhancement studies during pregnancy. The children lived in the laboratory's underground levels, in rooms designed to appear comfortable while remaining completely controlled. The rainbow room served as common area, its colourful painted walls and scattered toys suggesting normalcy that the constant surveillance and locked doors contradicted. Each child occupied a cell, disguised as bedroom, furnished adequately, but offering no privacy, no escape. They wore identical institutional clothing, their heads shaved for supposed hygiene, but actually to prevent individualization. Numbered tattoos on their wrists, marking them as experimental subjects rather than human children. Brenner positioned himself as father figure. The children called him Papa, encouraging emotional dependence that prevented rebellion. His approach combined affection and cruelty strategically. Children who performed well in testing received treats, kind words, brief privileges. Those who failed faced punishment, ranging from isolation to physical pain. methods calibrated to produce compliance without causing damage that would interfere with experimental goals. The manipulation was sophisticated, creating bonds of loyalty even as it traumatized. The training regimen focused on developing specific abilities. Sensory deprivation remained central. Children spent hours daily in the isolation tanks, learning to extend awareness beyond immediate physical space. They practiced remote viewing, attempting to describe distant locations. They underwent tests of telekinesis, moving objects through mental effort. They explored telepathy, reading others' thoughts, or projecting their own. The success rates varied dramatically between subjects. Some demonstrated genuine abilities, others showed nothing beyond chance results. Subject 8, Carly, developed expertise in creating illusions, making people see things that didn't exist. She could craft convincing visions that fooled all senses, useful for psychological warfare applications. In 1977, Carly managed something unprecedented. She escaped. Despite the lab's security, despite years of conditioning, she found a way out and disappeared into America's urban landscape. Brenner searched but never recovered her. The escape demonstrated that even his most controlled subjects retained capacity for independent action. Subject 11 exceeded all other subjects, including the original prototype, Henry. Jane's abilities emerged early and grew consistently. By age 5, she could move objects telekinetically with precision that others achieved only occasionally. By 7, she demonstrated remote viewing capabilities that proved accurate under controlled testing. By 9, her power had grown to levels that concerned even Brenner. She could kill with her mind, stopping hearts or crushing bodies through focused intention. She could access memories, invading consciousness to extract or implant information. The program's purposes extended beyond academic curiosity. Cold War applications drove the research priorities. The lab sent subjects on missions, remote viewing Soviet facilities attempting to influence enemy officials' thoughts, projecting consciousness into locations Americans couldn't physically access. The success of these operations remained ambiguous. Verification was often impossible, but enough apparent confirmations occurred to maintain funding and enthusiasm. Other subjects received less intensive development. Subject 2 through 7 existed, but received minimal documentation in surviving records. Subject 9 through 18 appeared in various documents, suggesting at least 10 children beyond 11 lived in the lab simultaneously during the late 1970s. Their names, origins, and ultimate fates remained classified or deliberately destroyed. What's clear is that Brenner maintained a population of psychically trained children throughout the decade, each representing years of investment in experimental development. The children's relationships with each other developed despite Brenner's attempts to prevent solidarity. They communicated when possible, shared small rebellions, offered comfort during isolation. These bonds, though fragmented by separation and surveillance, suggested humanity persisting despite systematic dehumanization. 11's friendship with some of the other numbers, though never deep given their circumstances, provided her only positive childhood experiences beyond occasional moments of approval from Papa. By 1979, 11 had become Brenner's most powerful subject, capable of feats that the other numbers could only approximate. Her abilities opened doors, both literal and metaphorical, that perhaps should have remained closed. September 8, 1979, began as an ordinary day at Hawkins' lab. It would not end as one. On September 8, 1979, the sterile corridors of Hawkins' laboratory became sites of unimaginable violence, and a doorway opened between worlds that defied conventional understanding of reality itself. The morning proceeded routinely: breakfast in the Rainbow Room, scheduled training sessions, the familiar patterns that structured every day in the underground facility. 11, 8 years old, participated in her morning exercises, demonstrating telekinetic precision by moving progressively smaller objects. The orderlies, including a friendly young man who had recently joined the staff, supervised with practiced efficiency. This particular orderly had shown 11 unusual kindness over previous weeks. He spoke to her gently, encouraged her during difficult exercises, suggested that Papa's methods were perhaps too harsh. 11, starved for genuine affection in an environment of clinical manipulation, responded to this attention with trust. The orderly seemed different from the clinical staff, more human, more sympathetic to her situation. What she couldn't know was that this orderly was Henry Creel, Subject 1, Brenner's original prototype, who'd lived in the lab for 20 years. Henry's placement as orderly represented Brenner's attempt at rehabilitation and monitoring. Years of suppression through surgical implant had muted Henry's abilities, rendering him controllable enough for supervised freedom within the facility. Brenner believed the implant had permanently dampened Henry's power, reducing him from dangerous asset to docile assistant. This assessment would prove catastrophically wrong. Henry had spent months cultivating Eleven's trust for a specific purpose. He recognized in her the power he once possessed, abilities that exceeded even his natural gifts. He understood that with her help, he could remove the implant, limiting his capabilities. He manipulated her carefully, positioning himself as her only true ally in a hostile environment, someone who understood her suffering and wanted to free her from Papa's control. The day progressed toward the incident Henry had orchestrated. During afternoon session, while 11 worked alone in testing chamber, Henry appeared and revealed his true identity. He showed her memories of his past, the Creel family murders, his capture by Brenner, the years of imprisonment disguised as treatment. He explained that Brenner had lied about everything, that the children weren't being trained to help people, but to become weapons. He asked 11 to remove his controlling implant, telling her they could escape together, that her power combined with his experience could overcome any security. 11, desperate for connection and confused by years of manipulation, complied. Her focused, telekinetic precision allowed her to extract the implant without surgical intervention, a delicate operation that required extraordinary control. The device removed, Henry's suppressed abilities returned explosively. 20 years of accumulated rage and power erupted from enforced dormancy. He thanked 11, then left her alone in the testing room while he pursued his true objective. What followed traumatized 11 so profoundly that her conscious mind suppressed the memories for years. Henry moved through the underground levels systematically, encountering the other numbers in the Rainbow Room and adjacent areas. Subject 2 through 18, children ranging from age 6 to 14, faced something they couldn't comprehend or resist. Henry's restored power exceeded anything they'd experienced. Their own psychic abilities, still developing and inconsistent, offered no defense against telekinetic force wielded with adult sophistication and homicidal intent. The massacre unfolded with terrible efficiency. Henry killed methodically, demonstrating power and control that revealed how much Brenner had suppressed. Some deaths were quick, others prolonged, methods varying based on Henry's mood rather than any practical consideration. The children's screams echoed through corridors designed to contain sound, heard by no one positioned to help. Staff members who attempted to intervene died alongside their subjects, adults proving as vulnerable as children to telekinetic assault. 11 emerged from the testing chamber to discover bodies throughout the facility. She saw children she'd lived alongside for years, reduced to broken forms arranged in attitudes, suggesting final desperate attempts at escape or defense. The psychological impact was overwhelming. She understood immediately that her action had enabled this, that removing the implant had unleashed the monster. Guilt and horror combined with rage at being manipulated, creating an emotional state that sharpened rather than dulled her abilities. She found Henry in the Rainbow Room, surrounded by evidence of his work, breathing heavily from exertion, but appearing satisfied. He attempted to convince her to join him, to leave together and use their combined abilities to reshape a world he considered fundamentally broken. 11 refused. Despite her youth, despite years of conditioning toward obedience, she recognized evil when confronted by its consequences. She attacked. The psychic battle between Henry and 11 demonstrated capabilities that transcended the lab's previous observations. The room itself became weapon and casualty, objects flying as telekinetic forces clashed, walls cracking from pressure waves generated by conflicting mental powers. Henry possessed experience and technique. 11 lacked, but she had something he didn't, pure emotional power driving beyond rational limitation. Her rage at betrayal, her guilt at enabling the massacre, her love for the murdered children, these feelings fueled abilities that exceeded any demonstrated in controlled testing. 11 couldn't kill Henry directly. His defenses were too sophisticated, his power too close to her own. But she could move him, push him away with overwhelming force. She gathered every fragment of ability she possessed and struck. A psychic blow that sent Henry flying backward through space. But there was no wall behind him, no physical barrier. Instead, there was a tear, a rip in reality itself that her desperate assault had created. Henry vanished through this opening, tumbling into somewhere else, somewhere that was not the Rainbow Room, not Hawkins' lab, not Earth. 11 collapsed, unconscious from the effort. Around her lay the dead, the facility's most classified program destroyed in minutes, emergency systems, urgency activated, sealing affected areas and alerting surface personnel. Dr. Brenner arrived to find his life's work shattered and his most valuable subject unconscious amid the wreckage. The gate 11 had accidentally opened remained, a rift in the wall showing glimpses of somewhere dark and wrong, somewhere that pulsed with decay and rot. When silence finally returned to the lab's lower levels, 11 lay unconscious. The other numbers were gone, and a crack in reality remained open, connecting Hawkins to a place that existed in parallel, a dark mirror where life had withered and died, where something ancient and patient now noticed an opening to a world it could consume. The lab contained the immediate crisis, suppressed 11's memories of that day, and continued its research. But the gate remained, and through it, occasionally, things would slip. The years following 1979 saw Hawkins' laboratory operating under unprecedented pressure, managing a phenomenon no one fully understood, while maintaining its facade of ordinary research. The gate couldn't be closed through any method Brenner's scientists attempted. It could be monitored, studied, and contained, but the rift 11 had torn persisted despite every effort at repair. The lab designated the lower level, containing the breach as Red Room, its highest security classification, ensuring minimal personnel exposure. Initial exploration of the dimension beyond the gate proceeded cautiously. Scientists in full protective suits, attached to safety cables, ventured through the opening, discovering an environment that defied easy categorization. The space beyond appeared to mirror the laboratory itself. Same walls, same layout, but transformed into something nightmarish. Everything was covered in organic growth resembling vines, but possessing unsettling mobility. The air was toxic, requiring respirators. The temperature was cold, but not fatally so. Most disturbing, the dimension seemed vast, extending far beyond the laboratory's boundaries, suggesting this alternate space mirrored all of Hawkins, possibly all of Earth. The exploration teams called this place the Upside Down, a term that captured its inverted relationship to normal reality. Everything familiar became alien, recognizable, but wrong. The vegetation that covered all surfaces moved with apparent purpose, reaching toward intruders, responding to their presence. Occasionally, creatures appeared, things that might once have been animals, but had adapted to this environment in ways that made them monstrous. The teams learned to minimize their time beyond the gate, understanding that prolonged exposure created psychological effects beyond simple fear. The lab's research priorities shifted dramatically. Understanding the upside down became paramount, superseding even the psychic abilities program that had created it. Scientists studied atmospheric composition, biological samples, geological structure, and spatial properties. They discovered that time behaves similarly across dimensions, events occurring simultaneously in both. They learned that the upside down possessed rudimentary awareness, a hive intelligence that perceived intruders and responded with hostility. 11 remained in lab custody throughout this period, traumatized by events she couldn't consciously remember. Brenner's methods had suppressed her memories of the massacre and Henry's fate, protecting her psychology from collapse, but also preventing processing of trauma. She continued her training, though with increased caution from handlers who now understood how dangerous she could become. Her compliance resulted partly from memory suppression and partly from having nowhere else to go. She had never existed outside the lab, possessed no identity beyond Subject 11, and had no family to return to. Small incidents occurred throughout the early 1980s, evidence that the gate's presence affected Hawkins in subtle ways. Electronics sometimes malfunctioned near the lab without apparent cause. Wildlife in surrounding areas displayed unusual behaviours, birds flying in confused patterns, deer appearing in unexpected locations. A few residents reported seeing things they couldn't explain, shadows that moved wrong, sounds with no identifiable source, brief glimpses of spaces that seemed to overlay normal reality. These incidents were rare enough that most people dismissed them as imagination or explained them through conventional reasoning. The lab maintained its cover story successfully. To Hawkins residents, the facility remained an energy research installation, slightly mysterious but fundamentally benign. The increased security measures implemented after 1979 were explained as necessary precautions following an industrial accident, plausible enough that few questioned the explanation. The steady employment the lab provided continued to benefit the town's economy, creating vested interest in not examining official stories too closely. Life in Hawkins proceeded normally through the early 1980s. The town experienced the decade's economic shifts, high inflation, and recession's impacts on American small towns. The downtown shopping district faced pressure from the newly constructed mall outside town. Families adjusted to changing American culture, cable television, personal computers, evolving social norms. Children born in the late 1970s grew into elementary age, forming friendships and establishing patterns that would prove significant when crisis came. The Byers family settled in Hawkins in 1980, Joyce taking a job at Melvold's General Store, while her husband Lonnie worked irregular construction. They had two sons, Jonathan, born in 1967, and Will, born in 1971. The Wheeler family had lived in Hawkins for generations, Ted and Karen raising 3 children in comfortable middle-class house. Nancy, born in 1967, Mike, born in 1971, and Holly, born in 1980. The Sinclair family arrived in 1978, Charles and Sue moving to Hawkins when Charles accepted a position at the lab. They had 2 children, Lucas, born in 1971, and Erica, born in 1977. The Henderson family consisted of Claudia and her son Dustin. Born in 1971, Claudia worked as a receptionist while raising her son alone after divorce. These families existed in separate orbits through the early 1980s, their children attending the same schools, but not yet formed into the friendships that would define them. The boys, Mike, Will, Lucas, and Dustin, met in elementary school, bonding over shared interests in science fiction, fantasy games, and comics. By 1983, they were inseparable, spending afternoons in Mike's basement playing Dungeons and Dragons and riding bikes through Hawkins' safe suburban streets. Jim Hopper arrived as Hawkins police chief in 1981, hired to replace retiring chief who'd served for 30 years. Hopper brought big city experience from New York, but also personal tragedy. His young daughter had died from cancer, his marriage had collapsed under grief's weight, and he'd spiraled into substance abuse that ended his city career. Hawkins offered escape and second chance. The position required little beyond managing minor crimes and maintaining community relations, suitable for someone recovering from trauma and addiction. By November 1983, Hawkins appeared completely ordinary. Children rode bikes through safe neighborhoods. Parents worried about report cards and mortgage payments. Thanksgiving approached with its promise of family gatherings. Beneath this normalcy, a 12-year-old girl was about to make a choice that would change everything. On November 6, 1983, 11 escaped, and Hawkins' hidden extraordinary history finally broke into its ordinary present. November 6, 1983, began with darkness and ended with deeper darkness still. In a single night, a girl broke free and a boy vanished, two events forever linked by the doorway between worlds. 11's escape wasn't planned long in advance. It resulted from accumulated desperation and sudden opportunity. After years of captivity and experimentation, after suppressed memories of trauma she couldn't consciously access, she reached a breaking point during routine testing session. Brenner's staff was preparing another sensory deprivation experiment, a procedure 11 had endured hundreds of times. Something in her refused this time. Her abilities, always responsive to emotional state, erupted with uncontrolled force. She killed 2 guards, smashed through locked doors, and fled into the laboratory's upper levels. The facility's security protocols activated immediately, but 11 moved faster than response teams could coordinate. She reached the exterior, escaped through a gap in the fence that maintenance hadn't yet repaired, and disappeared into the woods surrounding the lab. She wore only a hospital gown, was barefoot, cold, and terrified, but free for the first time in her life. Behind her, the lab mobilized search parties, deploying personnel with sedative weapons and instructions to retrieve her unharmed if possible, dead if necessary to prevent exposure of classified programs. While 11 fled through darkening woods, Will Byers was riding his bicycle home from Mike Wheeler's house. The boys had spent the evening playing Dungeons and Dragons in Mike's basement, a campaign that ended with Will's character facing terrible odds. The ride from Mike's house to Will's took about 10 minutes along streets Will knew intimately. He travelled this route dozens of times, pedaling through the November darkness without concern. Hawkins was safe. Nothing bad happened in Hawkins. Will noticed the lights first. The street lamps along the road flickered and dimmed. He dismissed this as electrical problem, common enough in older neighbourhoods. Then he noticed the cold, sudden, and profound dropping temperature in ways that November chill didn't explain. He heard sounds from the woods paralleling the road, movement too large to be normal wildlife, something keeping pace with his bicycle. He pedalled faster, feeling fear without understanding its source. The Demogorgon emerged from the tree line, ahead of Will. The creature had crossed through the gate hours earlier, drawn by instincts that recognized the barriers between worlds had thinned. It appeared humanoid, but wrong, tall and predatory, with head that opened like a flower to reveal rings of teeth. Its skin was pale and damp, stretched over an unnaturally elongated frame. It had no eyes but tracked Will perfectly, sensing him through means beyond conventional sight. Will abandoned his bicycle and ran. He made it to his house, burst through the door, and ran to the phone to call for help. Before he could complete the call, the lights failed completely. The Demogorgon appeared in the house, moving through walls as if the barrier between dimensions had dissolved. Will fled to the shed behind the house, grabbed a rifle his father kept there, and aimed at the creature approaching through the door. He fired. The bullet passed through the Demogorgon without effect. The creature reached for him, and reality tore open around Will, pulling him into the upside down. Joyce Byers returned home from her evening shift at Melvald's to find the house empty and Will's bicycle abandoned on the road nearby. She called Will's name, searched the house and yard, and found evidence of disturbance. The shed door open, her husband's rifle discharged, but no Will. She contacted police immediately, reporting her son missing. Chief Hopper responded personally, taking the report and initiating search procedures. He expected to find a boy who'd gotten lost in the woods or was hiding after some minor trouble. He didn't expect what would actually unfold. The party, as Mike, Lucas and Dustin called themselves, learned of Will's disappearance the next morning. They refused to believe he'd simply run away or gotten lost. Will knew these woods, these streets, better than anyone. Something else had happened. They organised their own search, riding bikes through the areas where they thought he might be, calling his name, looking for clues adults might miss. During their search on November 7th, the boys encountered 11. She appeared on the road in front of them, still wearing the hospital gown, soaked from rain, shivering. Mike approached her cautiously, asking if she needed help. She responded minimally, seeming terrified of everything around her. Mike, against Lucas's objections, brought her to his house, hiding her in the basement before his parents could see. The boys learned her name, or designation, from the unwind tattoo on her wrist. They began calling her Elle. 11's presence complicated everything. She possessed no language for explaining what she'd escaped from, no context for describing the lab or its purposes. She demonstrated her abilities, moving objects with her mind, showing the boys things they'd imagined but never believed possible. She knew something about Will. When shown his photograph, she reacted with recognition. Through a combination of drawings and gestures, she indicated that Will was near water, that he was hiding, that he was alive. At Hawkins High School, Nancy Wheeler attended a party at Steve Harrington's house while his parents were away. She brought her friend Barbara Holland reluctantly. Barb felt uncomfortable with the popular crowd, but accompanied Nancy to provide support. While Nancy connected with Steve, moving toward a relationship, Barb sat alone by the pool. She cut her hand on a beer can, blood dripping into the water. The Demogorgon, still hunting in Hawkins after taking Will, was drawn to the blood. It emerged from the woods bordering Steve's property and took Barb, pulling her into the upside down before she could scream for help. The lab's search for 11 intensified. Agents identified the boys as persons of interest after surveillance detected their interaction, with a girl matching her description. Brenner's team monitored the Wheeler house, listening to phone calls and tracking movements. They couldn't storm in directly without creating exposure, but they prepared to intervene at the first opportunity that allowed plausible deniability. The days following Will's disappearance unfolded with agonizing slowness for those searching and terrifying speed for those discovering the truth. Joyce Byers experienced something that challenged her sanity and ultimately confirmed her conviction. Will was trying to contact her. He couldn't speak, but he could manipulate electricity. The lights in her house flickered in patterns she recognized as deliberate. The phone rang with calls that produced only breathing and static. She bought Christmas lights and strung them throughout the house, creating a grid of illumination. When Will's presence manifested, the lights responded to his location. He spelled out messages letter by letter. RUNHERE. Hopper's investigation ran into systematic obstruction. Witnesses reported seeing things that didn't make sense. Evidence appeared and disappeared. Most frustrating, state police removed the case from his jurisdiction, citing resources and expertise his small department lacked. Hopper recognized a cover-up from his detective experience. Someone wanted Will's disappearance handled in a specific way. He began investigating parallel to official channels, pushing against resistance he didn't yet understand came from the lab. The boys continued hiding 11, rotating watch duties and sneaking her food from their kitchens. She demonstrated more abilities, crushing a Coke can with her mind, making a toy compass spin, and most impressively, locating Will. Using Mike's Dungeons and Dragons board and a photograph of Will, she entered something like a trance, her consciousness extending into the space between worlds. She confirmed Will was alive, hiding, scared. She indicated a location, an abandoned quarry where gates sometimes thinned. Nancy Wheeler and Jonathan Byers formed an unlikely partnership, investigating Barb's disappearance, which had occurred the same night as Will's. Nancy refused to believe her friend had simply left the party without saying anything. Jonathan had taken photographs near Steve's house that night, documenting his pain and isolation. One photograph showed something in the woods, a figure that didn't look human. Together they followed leads that conventional investigators ignored or dismissed. Their investigation led them to the woods, where they found something impossible. A tear in reality, a gateway that pulsed with wrong energy. Nancy, driven by determination to find Barb, climbed through. She entered the upside down, finding herself in the dark reflection of the woods she'd just left. She saw the Demogorgon feeding on a deer. Before it could sense her, Jonathan pulled her back through the gateway, saving her but confirming the terrible reality they'd discovered. The lab's interference in the investigation became undeniable. Hopper broke into the laboratory's filing rooms, finding documents about Will's case that should never have existed there. He discovered references to the Upside Down, to breaches in dimensional boundaries, to creatures that crossed between worlds. Brenner's people caught him but didn't arrest him. Instead, they negotiated. Hopper would receive access to information and resources in exchange for cooperation with the cover-up. He agreed, justifying the compromise through the potential to actually find Will. Joyce and Hopper gained access to the lab's classified areas, including the gate. They witnessed the rift, understood finally what they were dealing with. Lab personnel provided environmental suits and equipment for crossing. Joyce refused to wait for official rescue mission or additional preparation. She would find her son now, whatever the cost. Hopper, recognizing her determination and respecting her right to make that choice, went with her. Eleven's abilities developed further under the boy's protection. She could find people by concentrating on their photograph, projecting her consciousness to their location. She could move increasingly heavy objects. Her powers seemed to strengthen through use and emotional connection, rather than the clinical training she'd received. Mike's friendship, Lucas's grudging respect, and Dustin's encouragement provided something she'd never experienced: acceptance without conditions. The various investigations converged on the abandoned quarry, where the group discovered a stable gateway into the Upside Down. 11 could sense the wrongness emanating from the location. Nancy and Jonathan had determined this was where Barb had been taken. Hopper and Joyce had learned from lab personnel that this gate offered the most direct route to where Will was hiding. The lab's agents, tracking 11, descended on the location simultaneously. By late November, separate investigations had converged on the same terrible truth. There was another world beneath Hawkins. Will Byers was trapped there, and the only way to save him required confronting both the lab and the monster it had unleashed. The final confrontation approached, bringing together a police chief seeking answers, a mother refusing to abandon her son, a girl learning her own worth, and 3 boys whose childhood was ending in the space between dimensions. Late November 1983 brought Hawkins to a precipice where the boundary between ordinary and extraordinary finally shattered completely. The plan formed from desperation and improvised resources. 11 needed to locate Will precisely within the Upside Down. The sensory deprivation tank provided optimal conditions for her abilities, but the lab's tanks were inaccessible, given Brenner's pursuit. Dustin and Lucas applied their science class knowledge to create makeshift alternative, a kiddie pool filled with enough water and salt to approximate flotation conditions. They set this up in the middle school gymnasium, using the building's abandoned state during Thanksgiving break. 11 submerged herself in the improvised tank, wearing goggles to block sight, focusing her consciousness on Will's image. Her awareness stretched across dimensional boundaries, finding the dark reflection of Hawkins, where Will had survived for days. She saw him in his makeshift fort in the upside-down version of his house, weak from exposure and terror but alive. She spoke to him through the connection, her voice manifesting in his location, even though her body remained in the pool. She told him help was coming, that his mother wouldn't stop searching. While 11 searched, Joyce and Hopper prepared for their crossing. The lab provided environmental suits designed for upside-down exploration, equipment that filtered the toxic atmosphere and protected against the dimension's organic matter. They would enter through the gates in the lab's basement, travel to Will's last known all-wreck location, and extract him by force if necessary. Brenner allowed this operation partly to gather data on rescue procedures, and partly because denying a parent access would create exposure risks he couldn't afford. The boys faced a different threat. Lab agents had tracked 11 to the school, surrounding the building with armed personnel. Brenner himself arrived, prepared to reclaim his asset. He approached peacefully, speaking to 11 through locked doors, using the voice that had controlled her for years. He called her his daughter, promised forgiveness, insisted she return home where she belonged and where she'd be safe from a world that would fear her powers. 11 resisted, drawing strength from friendships that proved more powerful than Brenner's manipulation. The agents forced entry, creating confrontation that escalated rapidly. 11 protected the boys using abilities pushed beyond previous limits. She disarmed agents telekinetically, threw personnel across the gymnasium, and held back a dozen armed adults through focused will. The effort exhausted her, blood flowing from her nose in rivers, but she maintained control. In the upside down, Joyce and Hopper navigated the dark reflection of Hawkins, following 11's directions to Will's location. The dimension assaulted them with wrongness at every level. The air tasted of decay, the vines that covered everything moved with disturbing purpose, and the ambient sound suggested breathing from something vast. They found Will in Castle Byers, the fort he'd built in his backyard, now transplanted to its mirror location. He was unconscious, weak, attached by organic tendrils to the dimension's biological network. They cut him free, wrapped him in thermal blankets, and began the journey back to the gate. The Demogorgon attacked the school, drawn by the psychic energy 11 generated during her confrontation with the lab agents. The creature crossed into the gymnasium through a temporary breach it opened through sheer dimensional weakness. It appeared among the chaos of lab personnel and terrified children, a predator among prey. Brenner's agents fired weapons uselessly. The bullets passed through the creature without effect, its physical presence only partially manifested in normal space. 11 faced the Demogorgon alone, positioning herself between the creature and her friends. The confrontation tested every ability she possessed. She held the creature at bay through telekinetic force, preventing it from reaching Mike, Lucas, and Dustin. But the Demogorgon was stronger than she expected, a creature of the upside down, with instinctual access to that dimension's energy. It pushed against her mental barriers, advancing despite her efforts. She reached inside herself, accessing power she'd never fully utilized. In the moment when the Demogorgon lunged forward, she struck with everything she had, disintegrating the creature from within, unmaking its physical form through focused will. The effort consumed her. As the Demogorgon dissolved into ash and shadow, 11 vanished, pulled into the upside down by the energy she'd expended. Mike screamed her name, but she was gone. Joyce and Hopper emerged from the upside down, carrying Will. They rushed him to Hawkins General Hospital, where Dr. Owens and his team stabilized the boy. Will had survived exposure that should have killed him, sustained by youth's resilience and desperate determination to endure. He required intensive care antibiotics for infections from the Upside Down's toxic environment, treatment for hypothermia and malnutrition, and time to process trauma no child should experience. The lab initiated its cover-up protocol immediately. The story, crafted for public consumption, involved a boy who'd gotten lost in the woods, suffered exposure, and was found by search teams. Barbara Holland's disappearance received similar treatment. She'd run away following an argument at a party, tragic but not mysterious. Witnesses who claimed to see impossible things were discredited or convinced they'd misunderstood what they'd seen. The lab paid for Will's medical care, ensuring the family had no financial motivation to pursue uncomfortable questions. Brenner's fate remained unclear. He'd been present at the school during the Demogorgon attack. Some reports suggested the creature killed him. Others indicated he survived, spirited away by remaining agents for medical treatment. The ambiguity suited the Department of Energy, which needed to investigate the program's failures without fully exposing its existence. Hopper struck a deal that gnawed at his conscience but seemed necessary for protecting those involved. He would maintain silence about the lab's activities, discourage further investigation, and ensure the cover story held. In exchange, the lab would leave the children alone, provide resources for Will's recovery, and allow Hopper limited oversight of future operations. He hated the compromise, but saw no alternative that didn't risk the kids' safety. The Hawkins community processed the events through the filter of official narrative. A child had gotten lost and been found. A teenage girl had run away. These things happened. Tragic but explicable. Life returned to normal patterns. School resumed after Thanksgiving break. Families prepared for Christmas. Downtown businesses decorated for the holidays. The extraordinary faded back into the ordinary, visible only to those who'd experienced it directly. By Christmas 1983, Hawkins attempted normalcy. Will Byers recovered slowly, coughing up strange slugs and suffering nightmares. The boys mourned a friend who had saved them all. Joyce kept every light in her house burning. Hopper left Eggo waffles in the woods, hoping. And beneath the lab, despite their efforts, the gate remained, smaller but not sealed, a wound, in reality, that refused to heal. The year 1984 would begin with fragile peace, but peace built on unstable foundations cannot long endure. The months between December 1983 and October 1984 brought a period that felt like recovery, but was actually preparation, a calm that preceded a storm whose approach few recognized. Will Byers returned to school in January, physically healed but psychologically scarred. He rejoined his friends, resumed normal activities, and tried to pretend that everything was fine. His mother watched him obsessively, alert for signs that the Upside Down had left lasting effects. The episodes came frequently at first, flashbacks to his time in that dark place, sensations of being watched, moments when reality seemed to slip and reveal the rot underneath. Dr. Owens from the lab monitored Will's condition, conducting regular evaluations under the guise of following up on his exposure injuries. 11 had not died when she vanished after destroying the Demogorgon. She'd been pulled into the Upside Down, deposited in that dark reflection of Hawkins, where she wandered for days, surviving through her powers and stubbornness. She eventually found a gate, a crack between dimensions, small enough that the lab hadn't detected it, and pulled herself back into the normal world. She emerged in the woods, disoriented and starved, with no clear destination except away from the laboratory that would recapture her given any opportunity. Hopper discovered her during one of his patrols in February. He'd been leaving food in various locations, hoping irrationally that she'd survived and would find his offerings. When he finally encountered her, filthy and terrified, hiding in a drainage pipe, he made a decision that complicated his life immeasurably. He took her to his cabin, the isolated property where he'd moved after his divorce. He couldn't turn her over to the lab, not after everything he'd learned. He couldn't place her in foster care without documentation that would trigger investigations. So he hid her, creating a secret life that involved smuggling food, finding excuses for extended absences, and teaching a girl with no social skills how to live in the world. The cabin became Eleven's new prison, though Hopper insisted it was protection. She couldn't leave, couldn't risk being seen, couldn't have contact with anyone outside. Hopper established strict rules: no opening curtains during daytime, no making noise that neighbours might hear, no exploring beyond the cabin's immediate surroundings. These restrictions, necessary given the lab's continued interest in finding her, felt like captivity to a child who'd just escaped years of confinement. She accepted the situation because Hopper offered genuine care, something she'd never experienced from Brenner. Mike Wheeler struggled with Eleven's absence profoundly. He'd connected with her in ways that went beyond friendship, had seen in her someone who needed protecting and valued his protection. He attempted to contact her using his supercom radio, broadcasting into static for months, hoping she could somehow hear and respond. His friends worried about his obsession, but Lucas and Dustin understood the loss of someone who'd become family in the space of days. They resumed their D&D campaigns, returned to school routines, but the campaign felt diminished without the resolution of Eleven's fate. 2 newcomers arrived in Hawkins that summer, adding complexity to established dynamics. Maxine Mayfield, called Max, moved with her mother and stepfather, Billy Hargrove, from California to Hawkins. Max brought California confidence, skill at video games, and a skateboard that impressed the boys immediately. Her arrival created tensions, Lucas and Dustin both developing crushes, Mike resenting anyone who seemed to replace 11. Max earned acceptance through genuine interest in their activities and refusal to be intimidated by their initial resistance. Billy Hargrove, Max's older stepbrother, embodied toxic masculinity barely controlled. He took position as Hawkins High's new king through aggressive confidence, athletic ability, and willingness to fight anyone who challenged his status. Steve Harrington found his social position threatened by this newcomer who didn't respect established hierarchies. Billy's arrival introduced element of unpredictable violence to the high school's social scene. His anger at being relocated from California to Indiana manifested through cruelty to those he considered weak, particularly his stepsister. Dustin Henderson discovered something in his trash can in October, a strange creature resembling a pollywog, but clearly not native to any ecosystem he recognized. He adopted the creature, naming it D'Artagnan, Dart for short. The creature grew rapidly, developed sharp teeth, and demonstrated preferences for eating that extended to Dustin's cat. The boys' investigation of Dart's origin revealed the terrifying truth. It was a juvenile demogorgon, somehow escaped from the Upside Down into the normal world. This discovery indicated that the gate's closure hadn't been complete, that the boundary between dimensions remained permeable. Will's episodes intensified in October. His visions of the Upside Down became more frequent and more vivid. He saw not just the familiar dark reflection, but something else, something enormous and malevolent that existed within that space. The presence he sensed possessed intelligence beyond the Demogorgon's animal cunning. It noticed him, recognized him, and began establishing connection. During one particularly intense episode, Will described what he saw to his friends, a massive shadow in the shape of a spider, towering over the Upside Down's landscape, aware and hostile. The shadow monster, as the boys named it, represented the Upside Down's collective consciousness, a hive mind that coordinated the dimension's hostile response to intrusions. It had existed long before the gate opened, a presence that permeated that space like weather. The gate's creation had given it awareness of Earth, of the living world it could potentially consume and transform. Will's extended time in the Upside Down had created a connection the monster could exploit, a thread linking it to someone existing in the target dimension. By late October, Will's condition had deteriorated beyond simple flashbacks. He was being possessed, his consciousness invaded by the shadow monster's influence. The entity wanted a foothold in the living world, a host through which it could gather intelligence and coordinate attacks. Will fought the invasion, his sense of self-resisting assimilation, but the monster was patient and inexorable. It promised Will connection, an end to loneliness, through merging with something vast and eternal. Will, isolated by trauma his friends couldn't fully understand, found the offer seductive, despite its horror. Bob Newby entered Joyce's life that summer, bringing normalcy she desperately needed. Bob managed the local Radio Shack, possessed enthusiasm for technology and electronics, and approached life with optimism that bordered on naivety. He'd known Joyce in high school, had harboured affection for her for decades, and now saw opportunity to pursue relationship with this woman he'd never stopped thinking about. Joyce initially resisted, feeling that romance complicated her focus on her sons, but Bob's patience and genuine kindness eventually won her acceptance. Bob's involvement with the Byers family placed him in harm's way he couldn't comprehend. When Will's possessions intensified and Joyce sought solutions beyond Dr. Owen's clinical interventions, Bob contributed his technical knowledge. He helped interpret Will's drawings of the upside-down tunnel system, recognizing patterns that suggested geographic relationships. His map of the tunnels, created from dozens of Will's sketches, revealed the scope of the upside-down's physical presence beneath Hawkins, extending throughout the town and beyond in networks that suggested purposeful construction. The upside-down's tunnels existed not just in their native dimension, but were physically manifesting beneath Hawkins. The barrier between worlds had thinned enough that the upside-down's biological infrastructure was crossing over, creating a parallel network of passages that connected significant locations. Farmers reported patches of pumpkins rotting overnight, the produce desiccated as if something had drained all life. Investigation revealed that these rot fields marked areas where tunnels ran closest to the surface. Hopper investigated the tunnels, descending into passages that suggested organic origin rather than geological formation. The walls pulsed with disturbing regularity, biological processes occurring in substrate that seemed half fungus, half animal tissue. The air was thick with spores that invaded lungs and initiated contamination at cellular level. Hopper's exposure would create consequences that manifested years later. Microscopic organisms from the upside down establishing presence in his body, dormant but permanent. Steve Harrington's relationship with Nancy Wheeler had survived the crisis of November 1983, but both had been changed by experiences they couldn't discuss openly. Steve demonstrated capacity for heroism that contradicted his shallow reputation, while Nancy struggled with guilt over Barbara's death and frustration at the forced acceptance of official lies. Her relationship with Jonathan Byers, forged through shared trauma and investigation, created tensions that eventually fractured her bond with Steve. The love triangle resolved messily at Halloween party, where Nancy, drunk and disinhibited, told Steve their relationship felt fake, performance rather than genuine connection. By late October 1984, Will Byers was more puppet than person, the shadow monster pulling strings that dictated his actions, while his consciousness retreated into increasingly small space within his own mind. The monster used him to gather intelligence, learning Hawkins' layout, identifying targets, and coordinating the creatures serving as its physical extensions. Demo dogs, as Dustin named them, had been growing in Hawkins' tunnels since summer, developing from organisms like Dart into pack hunters that combined Demogorgon characteristics with group behavior. These creatures awaited the shadow monster's command to emerge and begin the transformation of Hawkins into extension of the Upside Down. Joyce, Jonathan, Mike, and Hopper recognized that Will's possession needed to be broken through extreme measures. They took him to Hopper's cabin, heated it beyond tolerance, and subjected Will to temperatures the organism infesting him couldn't survive. The theory held that the Upside Down's life, adapted to cold darkness, would retreat from intense heat. Will suffered terribly during the procedure, screaming as both boy and monster writhed in pain, but ultimately the heat drove the possession from his body, expelling the shadow monster's direct influence. But the exorcism alerted the entity to the threat these humans represented. It commanded its demo dogs to attack, targeting the lab where it sensed the greatest concentration of knowledge about cross-dimensional travel. The assault on Hawkins' laboratory came on Halloween night, with dozens of demo dogs emerging from tunnels directly into the facility's lower levels. The creatures moved through corridors with terrible efficiency, killing anyone they encountered. Lab personnel, trained for security protocols, but not actual combat with supernatural predators, died by the dozens. Bob Newby, who had accompanied Joyce and the boys to the lab seeking safety, died as a hero. When power failed and doors locked, trapping them in the building with the demo dogs, Bob volunteered to reach the breaker room and manually restore systems. He succeeded, enabling others to escape, but died before he could reach safety himself. The demo dogs caught him in the lobby as he ran for the exit, pulling him down within sight of Joyce, Jonathan, and Will. His death demonstrated the stakes of involvement in Hawkins' secret war. Ordinary people could be heroes, but heroism carried costs that families would pay for years. Eleven's isolation in Hopper's cabin ended when Mike's desperation finally broke through her restraints. She'd been listening to his radio calls for months, hearing his voice but unable to respond without revealing her existence to Hopper. In late October, she defied Hopper's rules, using her abilities to manipulate electronics and send a signal Mike would recognize. Their reunion, accomplished at the middle school during a crisis meeting about Will's possession, renewed her sense of purpose and connection to the world she'd been protecting from a distance. The plan to close the gate required Eleven's return to the laboratory, to the Red Room, where her accidental tear in reality persisted and grew. The lab's attempts to close it had failed. Brenner's replacement, Dr. Owens, understood that only the person who opened the gate possessed capabilities to seal it. He arranged Eleven's access despite objections from security personnel, who viewed her as dangerous asset to be contained rather than ally to be trusted. 11, accompanied by Hopper and escorted by lab personnel, descended into the Red Room. The gate had grown substantially since 1979, a tear in the wall, now large enough for vehicles to pass through, pulsing with organic growth from the Upside Down's biological material. She approached the rift, focusing her abilities as Brenner had trained her, channeling telekinetic force, not to destroy, but to heal, to knit the torn fabric back together. The shadow monster resisted, sensing its connection to the living world being severed. It sent tendrils of consciousness through the gate, attempting to stop 11 through psychic attack rather than physical force. She fought on two fronts simultaneously, maintaining the telekinetic pressure, sealing the rift, while defending her mind from invasion. The effort pushed her beyond previous limits, blood flowing from her nose and ears, her body shaking from the strain. But she held. The gate closed. The tear sealed completely, leaving only smooth wall where the portal had existed. The shadow monster's presence retreated, cut off from its invasion route. The demo dogs throughout Hawkins collapsed simultaneously, their connection to the hive mind severed. Will, freed from the possession's last remnants, breathed freely for the first time in weeks. 11 collapsed into Hopper's arms, unconscious but alive, having saved Hawkins at cost to herself that wouldn't fully manifest for years. The lab entered damage control mode, processing the casualties, dozens of personnel dead, the facility's lower levels damaged beyond immediate repair, and the project's exposure a constant risk. Dr. Owens managed the situation with pragmatic ruthlessness. Cover stories were crafted, bodies were explained through industrial accidents, families were compensated generously with non-disclosure agreements, and investigation were redirected away from truth. Hopper formalized his adoption of 11, working with Owens to create false documentation that would allow her legal existence. Jane Hopper, as she was now officially named, received birth certificates indicating she was Hopper's biological daughter who'd been living with his ex-wife in another state. The paperwork was thorough enough to survive casual scrutiny, allowing her to begin attending school in Hawkins, starting the next year. The snowball dance at Hawkins Middle School in December provided the year's end on a note of hard-won normalcy. Mike and 11 attended together, experiencing teenage romance's awkward beginnings. Lucas and Max danced, their relationship now official. Will and Joyce stood on the periphery, grateful simply to be alive and together. The adults watching, Hopper, Joyce, Jonathan, Nancy, Steve, understood that Hawkins would never be truly safe again, but that moments of peace made the vigilance worthwhile. Beneath the snow-covered town, in the Upside Down's cold darkness, the shadow monster waited. The gate was closed, but the tunnels remained, a network connecting dimensions that might serve as foundation for future invasions. The creature possessed patience, measured in geological time. It would find another way in. And when it did, Hawkins would face threats that made demo dogs seem trivial by comparison. 1985 began with cautious optimism in Hawkins. The gate was sealed, the immediate threat contained, and life appeared to settle into patterns resembling pre-1983 normalcy. Will attended therapy sessions with Dr. Owens, processing trauma through talk rather than invasive medical procedures. 11 adjusted to life as a regular teenager, attending school for the first time, navigating social hierarchies and academic expectations that her unique background made challenging. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin entered high school, joining the nerd hierarchy's lowest ranks while maintaining the friendship bonds that had survived interdimensional crisis. Joyce Byers continued working at Melvold's general store, saving money slowly toward goals that remained undefined but involved escaping Hawkins and its weight of trauma. She dated occasionally but found that men in Hawkins seemed either too aware of her history or too oblivious to her pain. Hopper settled into domesticity with 11, learning to be a parent again to a teenager whose needs and abilities made conventional child-rearing advice useless. Their relationship involved conflict over boundaries, her growing desire for independence clashing with his protective instincts. But underneath the arguments lay genuine love that neither had experienced fully before. The town's economic landscape shifted dramatically with the construction of Starcourt Mall, a massive shopping centre built on Hawkins' outskirts. The mall represented late 1980s commercial excess, dozens of stores under a single roof, food courts, movie theatres, and climate-controlled shopping that made downtown Hawkins' small businesses seem antiquated. The mall opened in June, drawing customers from throughout the region and devastating the traditional commercial district. Stores that had operated for decades suddenly faced competition they couldn't match. The convenience, variety, and novelty of the mall proving irresistible to consumers who'd previously had no alternative to supporting local merchants. The mall's construction proceeded unusually quickly, completed in under a year, when similar projects typically required twice that time. The construction crews worked around the clock, unusual for commercial project, but explained through aggressive scheduling by developers eager to capitalize on projected summer traffic. What wasn't known publicly was that the construction served dual purpose. The mall's legitimate retail was real, but beneath it, extensive underground construction created facilities hidden from casual observation. Soviet forces had infiltrated Hawkins through a complex operation that exploited the town's strategic value. Soviet intelligence services had learned about the Upside Down and the Gate information obtained through their own espionage networks, and from American defectors willing to sell classified material. The Soviets recognized that access to another dimension offered military advantages that could shift the Cold War's balance. If they could open a gate under their control, they could potentially weaponize the Upside Down's creatures, or harness the dimension's exotic energy for purposes America hadn't yet imagined. The mall's construction contractor was a shell company, controlled by Soviet intelligence. The legitimate construction workers handled the visible commercial space, while Soviet agents and sympathizers built a secret facility beneath the mall that extended deep into Hawkins' geological substrate. This underground complex housed experimental equipment designed to tear open reality, recreating the dimensional rift that 11 had closed. The operation involved dozens of agents, millions of dollars in resources, and represented one of the Cold War's most audacious covert operations. 11's relationship with Mike deepened through early 1985, teenage romance taking precedence over supernatural vigilance. They spent hours together, hanging out at the mall, talking on the phone for hours despite living in the same small town, experiencing the intensity of first love. Hopper viewed their relationship with paternal concern that bordered on paranoia. He'd lost one daughter and feared losing another to anything, including growing up. His attempts to limit their time together created friction that escalated through the spring. Max and Lucas's relationship followed on again, off-again pattern typical of teenage romance. Breakups triggered by minor misunderstandings or jealousies followed by reconciliations. Marked by dramatic gestures, their friends provided running commentary, Mike siding with Lucas by default, Dustin attempting diplomatic neutrality, Will remaining somewhat removed from the romantic drama that seemed to dominate everyone else's concerns. Will's distance from these preoccupations stemmed partly from lingering trauma and partly from dawning recognition that his attractions might not align with his friends' heterosexual assumptions. Nancy Wheeler interned at the Hawkins Post newspaper during summer, seeking journalism experience that would strengthen her college applications. She faced immediate sexism from the all-male reporting staff who dismissed her ideas, assigned her secretarial tasks, and made comments about her appearance that would be recognized as harassment in future decades, but were tolerated as workplace banter. In 1985, Jonathan worked at the Post as photographer, and their mutual frustration at the dismissive treatment Nancy received pushed them closer together, despite Nancy's lingering guilt about how her relationship with Steve had ended. Steve Harrington worked at Scoops Ahoy, an ice cream parlor in Starcourt Mall, wearing a ridiculous sailor uniform that demolished any remaining pretense of coolness he'd once commanded. His co-worker Robin Buckley, a band nerd from high school whom Steve barely remembered, provided running sarcastic commentary on their job and customers. Their dynamic began antagonistically. Robin resented Steve's former popularity and assumed arrogance, but evolved into genuine friendship as she recognized that his high school persona had been performance obscuring a fundamentally decent person. Dustin returned from science camp in early June, claiming to have a girlfriend, Susie, who lived in Utah. His friend's skepticism about her existence hurt his feelings, but wasn't entirely unreasonable. Dustin's enthusiasm sometimes exceeded his grasp of social reality. He'd also brought home a contraption built at camp, a high-powered radio transmitter that could reach impressive distances. While playing with the radio, attempting to contact Susie, he picked up a strange transmission, a Russian voice reading a code that changed every day. The discovery of a Russian transmission originating somewhere in Hawkins triggered investigation that would dominate the summer. Dustin recruited Steve and Robin to help translate and trace the signal, believing it represented a genuine spy operation rather than a prank. Robin's knowledge of Russian from language classes allowed rough translation of the coded message, revealing it contained shipping schedules and security protocols. The trio, calling themselves Scoop's Troop, investigated them all, determining that the transmission originated from somewhere within the massive complex. They discovered the Soviet facility through methodical surveillance and lucky breaks. A suspicious shipment entering the mall's loading dock contained materials obviously not destined for any audio retail operation. Following the shipment led them to a concealed elevator that descended far below the mall's basement levels. The facility beneath was extensive, laboratories filled with high-energy physics equipment, barracks housing dozens of personnel, and at the center, a massive machine designed to tear open the barrier between dimensions. The Soviet operation had successfully created a small gate by late June, a controlled tear in reality that allowed limited access to the Upside Down. Unlike the wild rift that 11 had accidentally created, this gate was contained within electromagnetic fields that theoretically prevented expansion. The Soviets were attempting to stabilize the opening, to maintain permanent access that would allow systematic exploration and eventual exploitation of the dimension's resources. But the gate's reopening had consequences the Soviets didn't anticipate. The shadow monster, cut off from Earth when 11 sealed the original gate, sensed the new opening immediately. It began infiltrating through the Soviet gate, sending tendrils of consciousness that sought hosts in the living world. The monster had learned from its previous attempt. This time it would be more subtle, possess more hosts, build strength before revealing itself. Billy Hargrove became the shadow monster's primary host in early July. He'd been working as a lifeguard at the community pool, attractive to women and bored by Hawkins' provincial limitations. The shadow monster identified him as useful, a physically strong individual with authority and mobility throughout the town. It possessed him gradually, invading his mind over several nights, replacing Billy's consciousness with itself, while maintaining enough of his personality to avoid detection. The flayed, as the possessed came to be called, began appearing throughout Hawkins in July. The shadow monster sought specific individuals, people in positions that would serve its purposes. Some were chosen for their access to chemicals or materials the monster needed for purposes that wouldn't become clear until later. Others were selected simply for the biomass their bodies represented. The possession occurred through close contact with someone already flayed, the shadow monster's consciousness transferring like a virus. 11 sensed the monster's return through dreams and intuitions. Her connection to the Upside Down, established during her time there and reinforced by her role in opening and closing gates, made her sensitive to dimensional breaches. She tried to explain her concerns to Mike and the others, but without concrete evidence, her warnings seemed like residual paranoia from previous traumas. When she finally located the source of her unease through remote viewing, discovering the flayed individuals and Billy's central role, the group understood they faced a threat that had been building invisible and undetected for weeks. Hopper and Joyce investigated a separate mystery, the strange behavior of Hawkins' rats. Hundreds of rats had been observed moving in coordinated groups, gathering in specific locations and consuming toxic chemicals that should have killed them. Joyce connected this to her experience with Will's possession, recognizing the hive mind behavior. She and Hopper discovered that the rats were being called to specific locations where they were consumed by flayed humans, their bodies broken down and added to a growing mass of biological material the shadow monster was accumulating. The various investigations converged on a terrifying revelation. The shadow monster was building itself a physical form in the real world, a body composed of the melted, recombined flesh of the flayed. This horror grew in the Brawley Steelworks, a massive abandoned factory that provided space for the construction. Dozens of people had been possessed and called to this location, where they were dissolved and added to the growing monstrosity. The creature that emerged from this process defied description, a mass of meat and bone twisted into something that approximated the shadow monster's true form, a physical manifestation of the Upside Down's consciousness. The plan to stop the Soviet operation required two simultaneous actions. The gate needed to be closed, severing the shadow monster's connection to its home dimension and weakening the physical form it was building, and the creature itself needed to be destroyed, accomplished through combat that would test every surviving member of the extended group that had formed since 1983. Hopper and Joyce, along with Murray Bauman, a conspiracy theorist who'd been investigating Hawkins's secrets independently, infiltrated the Soviet facility beneath the mall. They fought through security forces, disabled safety protocols, and reached the control room overseeing the gate operation. Joyce made the decision to destroy the machine. Despite Hopper's position in the facility's depths, she couldn't wait for his return without risking mission failure. The machine's destruction was catastrophic, triggering explosions that killed the Soviet personnel and appeared to claim Hopper as well. The gate closed violently, its electromagnetic containment failing and allowing it to collapse on itself. The shadow monster, in both its forms, the massive physical creature at the steelworks, and Billy's possessed consciousness felt the connection sever. Its power diminished immediately. The coordination and strength it drew from the Upside Down cut off. The monster thrashed in confused rage, attacking anyone within reach. Billy, dying from injuries sustained in the final battle, experienced a moment of returned consciousness. The shadow monster's weakened state allowed his suppressed personality to surface. He saw Max, his stepsister, whom he'd tormented and neglected, in danger from the creature controlling him. In his final act, Billy reasserted control and placed himself between the monster and Max, sacrificing himself to protect her. The monster killed him, but his resistance bought time for others to inflict the damage that finally destroyed the creature's physical form. The Battle of Starcourt ended with fire, explosion, and death. The mall burned, destroying evidence of both the Soviet operation and the interdimensional crisis. The official story involved a mall fire caused by faulty construction, satisfying enough to prevent deeper investigation. 30 people were confirmed dead, including a police chief who died heroically in the line of duty. Billy Hargrove's death was attributed to the fire, sparing Max the burden of explaining how her brother died fighting an interdimensional monster. Joyce Byers decided that Hawkins held too much pain to remain. She sold her house, packed her belongings, and moved with her sons to California, seeking distance from the town where she'd lost too much. She adopted 11, giving the girl legal family beyond her arrangement with the supposedly deceased Hopper. The move devastated Mike, who lost his girlfriend to cross-country distance before either had driver's licenses or resources for regular visits. Elle's departure transformed the group's dynamic. The party, which had always been 4 boys with Elle as extraordinary addition, became 3 boys dealing with Will's absence alongside Mike's grief. Max withdrew into isolation, processing Billy's death and their complicated relationship. The town moved into fall and winter with the sense that something essential had ended. Not just businesses downtown closing due to the mall's now absent competition, but a chapter of Hawkins' secret history reaching a conclusion. Hopper had not died in the facility's destruction. He'd been captured by Soviet forces who'd identified him as valuable asset worth preserving despite the operation's failure. He was transported to Russia, imprisoned in a labor camp in Kamchatka, where conditions made death seem preferable to survival. He endured through months of brutal captivity, maintaining hope through memories of 11 and determination to return to her. Joyce didn't know he'd survived, mourning a man she'd grown to love through their shared battles. She carried guilt about activating the machine's destruction while he was still inside, a choice made for the greater good, but costing her personally in ways that would haunt her for years. The separation year, 1985 into 1986, saw Hawkins attempting return to normalcy, while the major players tried to rebuild lives fractured by loss. The Upside Down remained quiet. No gates detected, no creatures emerging. The lab, discredited by its association with the Soviet infiltration, faced investigations and restructuring that reduced its influence in Hawkins. Dr. Owen's worked to protect those involved, ensuring the kids' identities remained classified and the true nature of the crises stayed buried, but his power to shape events diminished as oversight increased. Elle adjusted to California life while mourning Hopper and missing Mike. The distance strained their relationship. Phone bills mounted from hours of long-distance calls. Letters arrived regularly, but the physical separation made emotional connection harder to maintain. Elle struggled academically, her unusual background making standard curriculum difficult, and socially, finding that California teenagers seemed simultaneously more sophisticated and more shallow than her Hawkins friends. Will experienced some relief in California. Distance from Hawkins meant distance from trauma memories triggered by familiar locations. He began exploring his identity more openly, recognizing his differences and starting to accept rather than suppress them. Jonathan, now graduated from high school, supported his brother's journey while processing his own future, college applications, career decisions, questions about whether he wanted to stay connected to Nancy Wheeler long distance, or acknowledge that their relationship had been sustained more by proximity than lasting compatibility. Mike, Lucas, and Dustin entered their sophomore year at Hawkins High, joining the Hellfire Club, the school's Dungeons and Dragons club, led by Eddie Munson, a senior whose theatrical intensity and refusal to conform made him simultaneously admired and avoided. Eddie had repeated his senior year twice, his intelligence undermined by complete disinterest in academic performance. He poured his creativity into elaborate D&D campaigns and his garage band Corroded Coffin, building counterculture identity that rejected the conformity expected by Hawkins' mainstream society. Max withdrew from everyone following Billy's death. Her relationship with Lucas ended definitively. She pushed away attempts at comfort or connection, spending time alone with her Walkman, playing music loud enough to drown out thoughts. She blamed herself for Billy's fate, felt she should have recognized his possession sooner, should have fought harder to save him. The fact that he died saving her life only intensified the guilt. Her mother, struggling with her own grief and relationship with Neil, Billy's abusive father, provided insufficient emotional support. Max spiraled into depression that manifested as isolation and risk-taking behavior. Steve Harrington worked at Family Video with Robin, their friendship deepening through shared shifts and conversations that ranged from trivial to profound. Steve's post-high school life hadn't aligned with any grand plans. He'd been rejected from the colleges his parents expected him to attend, was working retail while figuring out what came next, and found himself increasingly comfortable with ambiguity. Robin came out to him gradually, trusting him with her sexuality in stages, and Steve's acceptance without judgment solidified their bond into something that felt more meaningful than his high school popularity had ever provided. Nancy Wheeler attended Emerson College in Boston, studying journalism and beginning to build identity separate from Hawkins and her relationships there. She maintained communication with Jonathan, but felt the relationship drifting, physical separation, revealing incompatibilities that crisis and shared trauma had obscured. Her experience at Hawkins Post, the casual sexism and dismissed ideas, motivated her to become the journalist who would have taken her seriously, who would have investigated Barbara's disappearance properly, who would tell stories that mattered even when they contradicted comfortable narratives. The year passed with surface calm. Hawkins High School resumed its routine of classes, sports, and social hierarchies. The downtown businesses adjusted to post-mall reality, some closing permanently, others finding niche markets the mall couldn't serve. The lab's reduced presence meant fewer government paychecks sustaining the economy, creating financial pressure that manifested in budget cuts for schools and civic services. The town faced a slow economic decline, not catastrophic but grinding, eroding quality of life in ways that frustrated residents who remembered better times. Beneath the apparent normalcy, something was preparing. In the Upside Down, the shadow monster had survived its defeat, weakened but not destroyed. It learned patience, waiting for the right moment to try again. And in a dimension, adjacent to both Earth and the Upside Down, Henry Creel, who'd been trapped there since 11 sent him away, in 1979, had been transforming. The dimension's hostile environment had ravaged him, turning him into something that resembled his humanity, only superficially. He'd been planning his revenge, waiting for opportunity to strike back at the world that had imprisoned and then exiled him. The year 1986 would begin with unearned peace, but spring break would bring revelations about the Upside Down's true nature, about monsters who had been planning for years, and about the costs that come from confronting evil that never truly dies, only waits. And far to the east, in a frozen labour camp where prisoners suffered in silence, Jim Hopper survived another day, clinging to hope that he would somehow find his way back to the daughter who needed him and who he needed just as much. The story wasn't over. It had merely been waiting for the right moment to resume. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be filled with brave friends, 80s nostalgia, and the gentle certainty that, even in darkness, ordinary people can do extraordinary things. The story continues, but rest is earned. Sleep well. The house at the end of Moorhead Street stood empty for decades, its windows dark, its paint peeling, its reputation sufficient to keep even curious teenagers away most nights. But in 1959, the Creel house had been new construction, modern ranch-style architecture that promised fresh starts to the family who purchased it that March. Victor Creel moved his wife Virginia and their 2 children, Henry and Alice, to Hawkins from Nevada, seeking a change in environment that he hoped would benefit his son's troubling behavioural patterns. Henry Creel was 12 years old when his family arrived in Hawkins, a boy whose intelligence exceeded his emotional maturity and whose interests ran towards subjects that concerned his parents. He collected spiders, studying their predatory behaviour with fascination that seemed inappropriate for a child. He demonstrated cruelty toward animals that Virginia discovered and tried to address through therapy and discipline. Most disturbing, Henry seemed to lack empathy, viewing other people as objects to be manipulated rather than individuals deserving consideration. Virginia Creel had noticed her son's differences early, but attributed them to phases that children experienced and outgrew. By the time Henry reached adolescence, she could no longer maintain this optimistic interpretation. He terrorized his younger sister Alice with psychological games that went beyond normal sibling conflict. He lied fluently, crafting explanations for his behavior that sounded reasonable until examined closely. He watched his family with analytical distance, as if studying specimens rather than living with people he loved. Victor Creel understood his son possessed problems, but believed that structure, discipline, and a fresh environment could redirect Henry toward normalcy. Victor had served in World War II, had witnessed human behavior at its worst, and possessed confidence that will and determination could overcome psychological difficulties. The move to Hawkins represented his attempt to impose these solutions, removing Henry from whatever influences in Nevada had encouraged his disturbing tendencies. The house itself seemed ordinary. 3 bedrooms, single story, typical American suburban design. The neighbourhood was new development, young families with children who would provide Alice with friends and Henry with peers who might model appropriate social behaviour. Victor secured employment at a local manufacturing plant. Virginia involved herself in church activities and community organisations. They created the appearance of normal family life, believing that performance of normalcy might eventually produce the genuine article. Henry's abilities manifested gradually, or perhaps they'd always existed and only became noticeable as his control improved. He could move objects without touching them, small things initially, making a toy slide across a table, causing a door to close when no one was near. He discovered he could affect other people's perceptions, projecting visions into their minds, making them see things that didn't exist. Most significantly, he could invade consciousness, reading thoughts and implanting suggestions that felt like one's own ideas rather than external manipulation. These powers terrified Henry initially, but fear transformed quickly into fascination and then into certainty of his own superiority. He possessed capabilities that others lacked, abilities that transcended human limitation. Why should someone with such gifts submit to ordinary rules, ordinary expectations, ordinary family obligations? His parents became obstacles to his development rather than authorities deserving obedience. His sister represented competition for resources and attention rather than someone to protect and cherish. The murders occurred on a March night in 1959, exactly 1 year after the family's arrival in Hawkins. Victor Creel would later describe that night in testimonies given to police, doctors, and eventually to journalists who covered the sensational case. He spoke of lights flickering, of his wife's behaviour becoming erratic, of Alice screaming about things crawling on the walls. He described discovering Virginia dead, her body broken in ways that suggested impossible forces. He found Alice similarly killed, positioned as if she'd tried to flee, but been caught before reaching safety. Victor survived because Henry wanted him to survive, to suffer the accusation, to live with the knowledge that everyone believed he'd murdered his family. Henry orchestrated every detail of that night, using his abilities to torment his mother and sister, while controlling his father's perceptions to create the appearance of Victor's guilt. The pleasure Henry derived came not just from killing, but from the elaborate deception, from crafting a narrative that would destroy his father's life, even as it freed Henry from familial constraints. Investigators found Victor covered in his family's blood, holding the murder weapon, unable to provide coherent explanation for what had occurred. His claims about supernatural events were interpreted as psychotic break, trauma-induced delusion, attempting to rationalize actions he couldn't accept committing. He was arrested, tried and committed to psychiatric institution rather than prison, deemed mentally incompetent but undeniably responsible. Henry disappeared from the narrative officially. Reports suggested he'd fled the scene, possibly deceased elsewhere. His body never recovered. In reality, Dr. Martin Brenner had been monitoring unusual incidents throughout the Midwest, searching for evidence of psychic phenomena that his research suggested might exist naturally in rare individuals. The Creel murders displayed characteristics impossible to explain through conventional means, suggesting the presence of someone with extraordinary capabilities. Brenner located Henry within days of the murders, finding the boy living rough in the woods, but adapting to self-sufficiency with disturbing ease. He recognized immediately what Henry represented: the natural occurrence of abilities Brenner had been trying to artificially induce through laboratory experiments. He negotiated Henry's cooperation through a combination of promises and threats, offering purpose and understanding in exchange for submission to study. Henry became Subject 1, the baseline against which all future subjects would be measured. He lived at Hawkins' laboratory for 2 decades, sometimes cooperating with Brenner's research, sometimes resisting, always plotting eventual escape. The surgical implant Brenner eventually installed to suppress Henry's powers represented the scientist's recognition that his first subject had become too dangerous to control through psychology alone. But the suppression was imperfect, and Henry's patience exceeded Brenner's caution. The Creel house remained empty after the murders, its reputation as a site of tragedy, preventing sale despite its structural soundness, and desirable location. Neighborhood children dared each other to approach it, inventing stories about ghosts and curses that bore accidental proximity to truth. The house waited, holding memories of the night when a boy decided that his family's deaths mattered less than his own freedom, when ordinary suburban architecture witnessed the emergence of something that would haunt Hawkins for decades to come. In the dimension where 11 had banished Henry in 1979, he had indeed transformed into something monstrous. The hostile environment had stripped away his remaining humanity, leaving only rage, power, and determination to return and complete the revenge he'd been planning since childhood. He called himself Vecna now, naming himself after the Dungeons and Dragons villain, whose evil and power matched his own aspirations. And in 1986, he would find a way back, bringing with him a curse that targeted the vulnerable and the guilty, that killed through trauma made manifest, that connected directly to the house where his own monstrous nature had first revealed itself. Spring break 1986 arrived at Hawkins High School, with the usual anticipation of freedom from academic routine, though for the seniors it carried additional weight as their final spring break before graduation and departure from the only home most had ever known. The week promised basketball championships, parties in the absence of parental supervision, and for a dedicated few, the conclusion of an epic Dungeons and Dragons campaign that had consumed Friday nights for months. Eddie Munson presided over the Hellfire Club with theatrical intensity that made the game feel like performance art rather than simple dice rolling. At 20, having repeated his senior year twice due to academic indifference rather than inability, Eddie had transformed his extended high school tenure into a statement of rebellion against institutions he viewed as fundamentally corrupt. He wore his hair long, dressed in denim and leather covered with band patches, and cultivated reputation as drug dealer and freak that he neither entirely deserved nor particularly worked to dispel. His intelligence manifested in creativity rather than conventional achievement. The campaigns he designed for Hellfire demonstrated sophisticated narrative construction, complex character development, and psychological insight into what motivated each player. He understood that Mike Wheeler needed challenges that tested leadership, that Dustin Henderson thrived on puzzles requiring lateral thinking, that Lucas Sinclair balanced strategy with impulsive heroism, that the freshman members needed guidance without condescension. Eddie's role as dungeon master allowed him to shape experiences for others in ways his actual life never permitted, creating worlds where choices mattered and heroism was possible. The championship game on March 21st created conflict between Hellfire's scheduled session and the basketball team's playoff game, which several club members wanted to attend to support Lucas, who'd made the team despite his nerd credentials. Eddie refused to reschedule, viewing the basketball game as representing exactly the kind of conformist popularity worship that Hellfire existed to reject. His inflexibility stemmed partly from principle and partly from insecurity that members might prefer mainstream acceptance to his outsider community. Chrissy Cunningham represented everything Hawkins High School valued: head cheerleader, popular, pretty, dating the basketball team, Captain Jason Carver. Her external perfection concealed internal torment that she'd hidden successfully for years. Her mother's obsessive control over her appearance and weight had created eating disorder and body dysmorphia that consumed Chrissy's thoughts. She suffered from worsening nightmares and waking visions, symptoms she attributed to stress and guilt, but which actually indicated something far worse targeting her. Chrissy approached Eddie at school on March 21st, seeking drugs that might quiet her mind enough to sleep. She'd never purchased drugs before, barely knew Eddie beyond his reputation, but desperation pushed her past fear and propriety. Eddie, surprised by her request, but recognizing genuine distress, agreed to meet her after the Hellfire session to provide what she needed. Their interaction represented collision between Hawkins' social strata that rarely mixed, the freak and the queen, discovering their shared humanity in parking lot transaction. The Hellfire session that evening reached its climactic confrontation, the party facing Vecna, the campaign's ultimate villain whose name Eddie had chosen months earlier without knowing it would soon carry terrible resonance. The players fought desperately, their characters' lives hanging on dice rolls that determined success or failure. The campaign concluded near midnight with hard-won victory, members celebrating their triumph before dispersing into the night. Eddie drove to his trailer home in Forest Hills, where Chrissy waited nervously in her car. She followed him inside, explained her symptoms in fragmentary sentences that revealed more desperation than she intended. Eddie went to his room to retrieve the drugs she'd requested, leaving her alone in the living room. When he returned, Chrissy had entered a trance state. Her eyes rolled back, her body rigid, unresponsive to his. Increasingly frantic attempts to wake her. What Eddie witnessed next would haunt him for the brief remainder of his life. Chrissy lifted into the air, floating impossibly several feet above the floor. Her limbs twisted at angles that bones shouldn't permit. Her jaw dislocated with audible crack. Her eyes collapsed inward, as if crushed by invisible pressure. The violence was systematic and deliberate. Something was killing her through methods that transcended physical possibility. Eddie screamed, ran toward her, tried to reach her, but she was beyond help. Her body dropped to the floor, broken and dead, while Eddie stood paralyzed by horror and incomprehension. He fled. The decision was instinctive, rather than calculated, driven by terror and recognition that no one would believe his account of what had occurred. A drug dealer, alone with a dead cheerleader in his trailer, would be convicted regardless of truth. Eddie ran into the night, his van left behind along with Chrissy's body, disappearing into Hawkins with no destination beyond a way. Jason Carver discovered his girlfriend missing when she failed to return from an errand she'd mentioned vaguely. Her car was found at Forest Hills Trailer Park. Police discovered her body in Eddie Munson's trailer. The physical evidence, the notorious freak, the beloved cheerleader, created narrative too compelling to resist. The manhunt began immediately, focused entirely on Eddie as suspect in murder that appeared to involve sadistic torture. The satanic panic that had been building in conservative American communities throughout the 1980s found perfect target in Eddie Munson and Dungeons & Dragons. The game, already controversial among parents who feared its occult themes, became explanation for Chrissy's ritualistic appearing murder. Eddie's interest in metal music, his dark clothing, his rejection of Christian values, all were reinterpreted as evidence of demonic influence. Jason Carver, devastated and enraged, positioned himself as crusader against satanic evil, organizing search parties and vigilante justice that law enforcement couldn't entirely control. Hawkins divided along ideological lines. Those who believed Eddie was capable of murder found their prejudices confirmed, while those who knew him recognized that his theatricality masked fundamental gentleness, incapable of such violence. The town's teenagers split similarly, popular athletes and cheerleaders following Jason's certainty, while the outcasts and nerds defended their dungeon master despite mounting evidence. The fracture exposed tensions that had existed beneath Hawkins' surface for years, divisions about religion, conformity, and whose version of reality deserved acceptance. Mike, Dustin, and Lucas understood immediately that Eddie was innocent and that something supernatural had killed Chrissy. They'd seen too much, fought too many creatures from the upside down to accept conventional explanation for death that defied natural law. They began their own investigation, searching for Eddie before police or vigilantes found him, determined to protect their friend while discovering what had actually killed Chrissy Cunningham. The spring break they'd anticipated with excitement had transformed overnight into another crisis, another fight against forces that most of Hawkins refused to acknowledge existed. Fred Benson died on March 22nd. his body found near the abandoned Creel house, with injuries matching Chrissy's impossible trauma. Patrick McKinney followed on March 23rd, lifted into the air at Lover's Lake, while Jason Carver and his friends watched helplessly, his limbs breaking, his life ending in front of witnesses who could no longer deny that something beyond human capability was killing Hawkins' teenagers. The pattern became undeniable to those willing to see it. 3 deaths in 3 days, each victim experiencing visions and headaches in the days preceding their murder, each killed through supernatural violence that left their bodies twisted and their eyes destroyed. Nancy Wheeler returned to Hawkins from college for spring break, immediately sensing that the town's crisis involved forces she'd fought before. She contacted Robin Buckley, and together they investigated the deaths, compiling evidence that police either ignored or couldn't interpret. They discovered connections the victims shared beyond their attendance at Hawkins High. Each had been suffering from guilt, trauma, or psychological distress that they'd hidden from others. Chrissy's eating disorder and family abuse, Fred's responsibility for a car accident that had injured someone, Patrick's experience of violence at home. The killer selected victims based on their emotional vulnerability, targeting those whose pain made them susceptible to whatever method the entity employed. Max Mayfield recognized herself in the pattern with dawning horror. Since Billy's death, she'd withdrawn into isolation, marked by depression symptoms she hadn't acknowledged as clinical. She experienced intrusive thoughts about her brother's final moments, guilt about her relief that he was gone mixing with grief about losing him before their relationship could heal. She'd stopped participating in activities she once enjoyed, avoided her friends' attempts at connection, and listened to Kate Bush's Running Up That Hill on repeat, using the music to drown out her spiraling thoughts. The headaches began on March 23rd. Mild initially, they intensified rapidly into pain that made concentration difficult. Her nose bled spontaneously, drops of blood appearing without apparent cause. She saw things that couldn't be real, flickering visions of the Creel house, glimpses of a figure whose face was obscured but whose presence radiated malevolence. She hallucinated Billy, not as he'd been in life, but as something wearing his appearance, speaking with his voice, but delivering messages designed to intensify her guilt. Max understood she'd been marked, chosen, as the entity's next victim, according to patterns she'd helped identify. Rather than hide this realization, she shared it with her friends, giving them opportunity to intervene before the curse progressed to its fatal conclusion. Lucas, despite their breakup and her subsequent rejection of his support attempts, mobilized immediately to help. Dustin applied his analytical mind to researching explanations. Steve and Robin, drawn into the crisis through Nancy's investigation, contributed their experience fighting upside-down threats. The group's research led them to Victor Creel, still confined to psychiatric institution decades after his family's murders. Nancy and Robin visited him under pretense of journalism students researching historical crimes, gaining access to interview the elderly man whose story had become Hawkins' legend. Victor's account, delivered with lucidity that contradicted his documented insanity, described his wife and daughter's torment before their deaths, visions of spiders and decay, voices whispering their failures and sins. But Victor revealed something crucial that police records had omitted. Music had helped during that terrible night. Virginia had begun playing her favourite record when the attack started, and while the music played, the supernatural assault paused. She'd felt drawn toward the music, as if it anchored her to reality against forces trying to pull her elsewhere. Victor had survived, partly because he'd been listening to music through headphones when the worst occurred, the sound providing protection he hadn't understood at the time. This revelation suggested defense mechanism against the entity's method. The curse apparently operated by pulling victims' consciousness into a trance state, transporting them psychologically to some other space where the entity could attack them directly. Music particularly music with strong personal meaning, could anchor consciousness to physical reality, preventing the transportation that preceded death. The specificity mattered. Songs needed emotional resonance to work. Generic music wouldn't provide the necessary psychological tether. Max's connection to Running Up That Hill made the song her lifeline. She'd listened to it hundreds of times since Billy's death, finding in Kate Bush's lyrics about trading places with someone to understand their pain a reflection of her own wish that she could have saved her brother by taking his place. The song had become intertwined with her grief processing, carrying emotional weight that transcended its musical qualities. When the curse's effects intensified on March 24th, pulling her consciousness toward the space where Vecna waited, her friends played the song, using portable cassette player to surround her with the music that meant everything to her survival. The technique worked. Max felt herself being dragged through darkness towards something hungry and patient, but the music reached her, even in that space, creating threads she could follow back to her body, to the physical world where her friends called her name. She returned gasping, terrified, but alive. The curse's hold had been broken, at least temporarily, by the anchor that music provided. Understanding the pattern didn't eliminate the threat. Vecna, as they began calling the entity after discovering the name's significance, in both Eddie's campaign and the Creel murders, had been interrupted in claiming Max but hadn't been destroyed. He would try again, selecting new victims from Hawkins' traumatized and guilty population. The defense they'd discovered only protected individuals, did nothing to stop the curse at its source. The investigation had revealed the killer's method, but not his identity or location. They needed to understand not just how Vecna killed, but who he was, where he existed, and how to reach him before he completed whatever larger purpose these murders served. 3 investigations proceeded simultaneously across thousands of miles, each seeking answers to questions that seemed unrelated until connections revealed themselves through careful attention to details others had missed. In Lenora Hills, California, 11 experienced frustration that bordered on panic as she attempted to locate whoever was killing teenagers in Hawkins. Mike had called, his voice tight with fear, explaining that something from the upside down was hunting again. She tried immediately to access her abilities to project her consciousness across the country and identify the threat, but nothing happened. Her powers, dormant since the gates closing in 1985, refused to respond regardless of how desperately she concentrated. The powerlessness terrified her more than any monster had. Throughout her life, her abilities had defined her value and purpose. Without them, she was just Jane Hopper, a teenage girl with no context for normal life, struggling in school, isolated from peers who couldn't understand her background. Mike needed her. Her friends were in danger, and she could do nothing except feel useless and abandoned by the gifts that had once made her extraordinary. Will sensed something as well, a familiar coldness at the base of his neck that he'd learned to associate with the Upside Down's presence. His connection to that dimension, established during his time there and reinforced through possession, made him sensitive to its activity even at this distance. He couldn't identify specifics, but he knew with certainty that whatever threatened Hawkins originated from the dark mirror world he'd barely escaped years earlier. He and Elle shared their concerns, recognizing that their California exile had removed them from battles they were uniquely equipped to fight. In Hawkins, Nancy's investigation took her to the abandoned Creel house, where she discovered the structure's history connected to the current murders through Victor Creel's testimony. While exploring the decaying building with Robin, Steve and Dustin, she became separated from the group, drawn upstairs by impulses she couldn't entirely explain. In an empty bedroom, reality shifted, the decay and abandonment transforming into furnished space from decades earlier. She'd been pulled into a vision, transported psychologically into the past to witness the Creel family's final night. The vision showed her Henry Creel, not as the 12-year-old boy from Victor's account, but as Vecna wanted her to see him. She witnessed his murders of Virginia and Alice, saw the pleasure he derived from their suffering, understood that the entity killing Hawkins' teenagers had been human once, had chosen monstrosity long before the Upside Down transformed his body to match his nature. Most significantly, she saw his face before the dimension's corruption, recognizing features that would help identify him if photographs existed from that era. But the vision was also trap. Vecna had allowed Nancy to witness these scenes because she was his next intended victim, chosen for her guilt about Barbara Holland's death and her investigative interference in his plans. He revealed himself to her, no longer the boy from 1959, but the creature he'd become, humanoid but wrong, covered in the Upside Down's organic matter, his face marked by the dimension's decay. He told her his intentions through visions rather than words, showing her Hawkins split by 4 massive gates, the town consumed by the Upside Down's expansion into the real world. 4 murders would open these gates. He'd completed 3. 1 remained. Nancy escaped the vision when her friends played music, discovering her favourite song through trial and error. She returned to consciousness in the Creel house's dusty bedroom, gasping and terrified, but armed with intelligence about their enemy's identity and plans. The information came at cost of trauma and near death, but it provided what they'd lacked, understanding of who they fought and what he intended. Across the world, in Kamchatka, Russia, Jim Hopper had survived months of imprisonment through determination, fueled by promises he'd made to himself. He would see 11 again. He would tell Joyce how he felt. He would return to Hawkins and resume the life that explosion had stolen. The labor camp where Soviets held him contained other American prisoners, men captured during various operations who become inconvenient to acknowledge or exchange. Among them was Dmitry Antonov, a Russian guard who developed conscience about his country's methods and sought escape for both moral and practical reasons. Their escape attempt involved Murray Bauman and Joyce Byers, who'd received evidence that Hopper survived through intelligence channels Murray had cultivated during his investigative journalism career. Joyce's reaction to learning that the man she'd mourned still lived mixed relief, with rage at the months she'd spent believing him dead. She and Murray travelled to Russia on rescue mission that seemed impossible but which Joyce would pursue regardless of odds. Hopper was alive and she would bring him home or die trying. The parallel investigations converged on a single revelation that Nancy's vision had provided, but which required Elle's history to interpret fully. The lab massacre of 1979, which Dr. Owens had mentioned obliquely but never explained completely, connected directly to Vecna's identity. Henry Creel had been Subject 1, the original child in Brenner's program, the prototype for all subsequent experimental subjects. Elle had encountered him as the friendly orderly, had unwittingly freed him, and had banished him to the dimension where he'd transformed into the monster now threatening Hawkins. Vecna, Henry Creel, and Subject 1 were the same person, a killer whose evil predated the Upside Down, but who'd been shaped by that dimension into something far worse than he'd been originally. Understanding this changed everything about how they needed to fight him. Dr. Sam Owens maintained contacts within the Department of Energy despite the political pressure that had reduced his influence following the Soviet infiltration disaster. When he learned about the murders and recognized their supernatural characteristics, he reached out to the scattered members of the group who'd fought previous upside-down incursions, offering resources the government still possessed despite its official denials about dimensional threats. His call to the Byers household in California provided the catalyst that brought separated friends back together for what everyone understood would be their most dangerous confrontation yet. Jonathan, Will, Mike, and Argyle Jonathan's California friend, who'd become inadvertently involved through proximity, drove cross-country in a stolen pizza delivery van, covering the distance in shifts that prioritized speed over safety. Elle travelled separately with Owens and a small team of loyalists who understood that her abilities represented humanity's best chance against Vecna. Her powers had begun returning during the journey, sparked by desperation and by specialized training Owens facilitated at an abandoned facility in Nevada. The sensory deprivation tanks Brenner had used as training tools still existed in mothballed government installations, and Owens authorized their use over Elle's objections. She needed her abilities back, and the methods she hated remained the most effective means of accessing her full potential. In Hawkins, the remaining group members compiled intelligence about Vecna's patterns, vulnerabilities, and goals. Nancy's vision had revealed his intention to open 4 gates through 4 murders, creating splits in reality that would allow the Upside Down to consume Hawkins entirely. 3 murders had occurred. 1 remained necessary to complete his design. Max understood she remained marked, that her earlier escape through music had postponed rather than cancelled her selection as victim. This realization led to the plan's most controversial element, using Max as bait. The strategy required Max to allow Vecna to pull her into his consciousness space, the mental realm where he conducted his murders. Once there, she would serve as distraction, while others attacked him in the physical Upside Down, where his actual body remained vulnerable despite his consciousness projecting elsewhere. The plan demanded precise timing and coordination across multiple locations. Hawkins, the Upside Down, accessed through existing gates at known locations, and the mental space where Max would face the entity that had already killed 3 people using methods she would need to resist long enough for others to act. Elle's role involved entering Max's mind alongside her, providing protection and combat support in the psychic dimension where Vecna's power concentrated. Elle had fought him once before, in 1979, banishing him to the Upside Down through desperate telekinetic assault. This time, she would need to be stronger, more controlled, capable of sustaining assault long enough to either destroy him or damage him sufficiently that physical attacks in the Upside Down could finish what she started. The physical attack team would include Steve, Nancy, Robin, and Eddie, who'd been hiding in the Upside Down since discovering that gates still existed providing access to that dimension. They would locate Vecna's physical form, which Nancy's vision suggested remained in the Creel house's Upside Down reflection, and attack using weapons that combined conventional damage with knowledge about the Upside Down's vulnerabilities. Fire worked against the dimension's organic matter. The creatures that inhabited it could be killed through sufficient physical trauma. Vecna, despite his powers, still possessed a body that could theoretically be destroyed if they inflicted enough damage. Dustin and Lucas would remain with Max in the real world, monitoring her vital signs and maintaining the music that anchored her consciousness during Vecna's attacks. They would also serve as communication hub, coordinating between groups separated by dimensional barriers using the radio equipment Dustin had been refining since his first experiments with transmission devices years earlier. Erica Sinclair, Lucas's younger sister, had proven herself capable during the Starcourt crisis and volunteered to assist despite everyone's reservations about involving a child in combat operations. Hopper's rescue mission succeeded on March 26th, Joyce and Murray extracting him from the Russian prison through combination of bribery, violence, and desperate improvisation that would have been impossible without Dimitri's insider knowledge. Hopper emerged from captivity diminished physically but mentally intact, his first questions about Elle and whether Hawkins remained safe. Learning that both his daughter and his town faced existential threat motivated him through the exhaustion and recovery his body needed. He would return home, would fight beside those he'd left behind, would finish what he'd sacrificed everything to protect. The weapons they gathered reflected both conventional warfare and lessons learned from previous battles. Molotov cocktails, rifles, shotguns, axes, spears, crafted from materials available in the Upside Down. They tested theories about what might work against Vecna's transformed flesh, discovering that the same vulnerabilities affecting demo dogs and other creatures applied to him. He could be hurt. Whether he could be killed remained uncertain, but hurt was enough to work with. The group reunited in Hawkins on March 27th, friends who'd been separated for months or years, embracing with relief, tempered by recognition that reunion came during crisis rather than celebration. Elle and Mike's reunion carried particular emotional weight, their relationship having survived distance but barely, needing physical proximity to remember why they'd fought so hard to maintain connection. Hopper and Elle's reunion involved tears, apologies, and mutual acknowledgement that their family, however unconventional, mattered more than anything else. The plan was desperate, relying on factors they couldn't control and timing they couldn't guarantee, but desperation had worked before. Against the Demogorgon, against the Mind Flayer, against Soviet operations and government cover-ups. They'd survived through combination of courage, friendship, and willingness to sacrifice for each other. Vecna represented their greatest threat yet, a human intelligence directing supernatural power toward goals that went beyond survival or hunger. He wanted to reshape reality itself, to make Earth into extension of the Upside Down's nightmare landscape. They would stop him or die trying. No other options existed. March 27, 1986, brought Hawkins to a confrontation that would be measured not in hours but in minutes that stretched with the terrible elasticity of crisis. The attack began at dusk, when the boundary between day and night created transition, mirroring the threshold they would cross between dimensions. Max positioned herself in the Creel house, the real-world version where Victor had lost his family, where Henry had begun his transformation from troubled child to monster. She wore headphones prepared with her Lifeline song, but wouldn't activate the music until Vecna's hold on her was established enough to draw his full attention. Steve, Nancy, Robin and Eddie entered the Upside Down through Lover's Lake Gate, the water providing passage between worlds as it had before. They emerged in the dark reflection of Hawkins, their bodies adjusting to the toxic atmosphere through respiratory protection jury-rigged from materials they'd gathered. The Creel house stood before them, recognizable but transformed by the dimension's organic corruption. Vines covering every surface, the air thick with spores that caught light filtering through the permanent twilight. Eddie had volunteered for the mission, despite knowing his fugitive status made return to normal life impossible, regardless of outcome. He'd accepted that Hawkins would always view him as monster or scapegoat, that Jason Carver's crusade had poisoned too many people against him for truth to matter. But he could die doing something meaningful, protecting friends who'd believed in him when everyone else condemned. His guitar, carried into the Upside Down, for purposes the others questioned until he explained, would serve as both distraction and weapon. Amplified sound-drawing creatures, away from Max's location, while the attack team moved into position. 11 submerged in sensory deprivation tank in the buyer's living room. Hopper and Joyce standing guard, prepared to extract her if the psychic battle went wrong. She projected her consciousness across distance and dimension, finding Max's mind as Vecna's assault began. Together, they would face him in the mental space he controlled, buying time measured in heartbeats for the physical attack to succeed. Max felt herself pulled from the Creel house's dusty room into somewhere else. The space resembled Hawkins, but wrong. Architecture twisted, sky red, everything dead or dying. Vecna waited, towering and terrible, speaking with Henry Creel's voice about her guilt, her worthlessness, her certainty that she deserved Billy's fate more than he had. The psychological assault targeted every vulnerability she possessed, every moment of self-loathing she'd experienced since her brother's death. Elle appeared beside Max, manifesting in the mental space through effort that made blood flow from her nose in both locations, psychic and physical. She confronted Vecna with powers restored through desperate training and deeper understanding of their shared history. They'd been raised in the same laboratory, had suffered under the same man's experiments, had both killed in self-defense and justified those deaths through necessity. But where Elle had found connection and love that anchored her humanity, Henry had embraced isolation and power that eroded his until nothing remained except hunger for destruction. The psychic battle unfolded through exchanges that defied physical law, telekinetic force meeting, telekinetic resistance, consciousness grappling with consciousness. Elle held Vecna's attention, while Max retreated into memories of happiness, moments with friends and family that contradicted his assertions about her worthlessness. The music played, Kate Bush's voice providing the thread that kept Max's sense of self intact against assault designed to shatter identity completely. In the Upside Down's Creel house, Steve and Nancy located Vecna's physical form, suspended in organic webbing, his body present even as his consciousness fought elsewhere. They attacked with Molotov cocktails first, fire spreading across the vines supporting him, causing the dimension's living matter to recoil and writhe. Robin followed with shotgun blasts targeting his head and chest, inflicting damage that would have killed. Normal human instantly, but only wounded this transformed thing. Eddie's distraction worked too well. His amplified guitar drew not just demo bats, the flying creatures that served as the Upside Down's aerial predators, but masses of them, hundreds responding to sound that violated their dimension's usual silence. He played Metallica, master of puppets, the aggressive riffs serving as battle cry and final performance. Dustin begged him to run, to retreat to safety, but Eddie understood that stopping would allow the creatures to attack his friends before they completed their mission. The demo bats descended on Eddie with overwhelming numbers. He fought with makeshift weapons, killed dozens, but couldn't withstand the swarm. They pulled him down, their teeth finding gaps in his protection, their coordinated attack demonstrating the hive intelligence directing them. He died in the Upside Down's cold darkness, bleeding from countless wounds, his final words to Dustin transmitted through failing radio, expressing no regret about his choice. Vecna's physical body suffered damage that would have killed him if Elle's psychic assault had continued long enough to prevent healing. But she couldn't maintain the attack's intensity. He was too strong, too practiced in using these powers, too willing to sacrifice anything for victory. He broke through her defenses, struck at Max through the opening Elle's exhaustion created, began the killing sequence that had murdered Chrissy, Fred, and Patrick. Max's bones began breaking, her eyes started to collapse. Lucas screamed her name, begged her to hold on, to remember the music, to stay with him. Elle, desperate and failing, reached deeper than she'd ever accessed, found power born from love rather than training, and struck Vecna with everything she possessed. The blow didn't kill him but hurt him, damaged him enough that his concentration broke, and Max fell from his grip. She dropped back into her body, but the damage was done. Her heart had stopped. Lucas began CPR, compressions counted desperately, breath forced into lungs that didn't respond. Elle, still connected psychically, reached into Max's fading consciousness and pulled, refusing to let her friend die, using her powers not to attack or defend but to sustain life that was slipping away. Max's heart restarted, but she didn't wake. She breathed but remained unconscious, her mind damaged by trauma that medicine couldn't address. Vecna survived the attack, weakened but not destroyed, and despite their efforts, despite Eddie's sacrifice and Max's near death, he'd accomplished his goal. 4 gates opened, massive tiers in reality, appearing at cardinal points around Hawkins, splitting the town along lines that would allow the Upside Down to bleed through. The dimensional barrier they'd fought so hard to maintain collapsed, creating wounds that grew even as the group watched helplessly. The earthquake that followed was listed officially as magnitude 7.4, unprecedented for Indiana's stable geology. Buildings collapsed, fires erupted, infrastructure failed, but the earthquake was symptom rather than cause, reality responding to dimensional breaches that shouldn't exist. Hawkins split physically along the gate's paths, massive fissures opening in streets and neighborhoods, swallowing homes and vehicles. The devastation killed dozens outright and displaced hundreds more, refugees from a disaster no one could explain satisfactorily. The aftermath brought exhaustion, grief, and recognition that victory remained incomplete. Eddie Munson died branded as murderer, his heroism known only to those who'd fought beside him. Max Mayfield lay comatose in Hawkins Hospital, her survival uncertain, her future dependent on whether her mind could heal from damage L's intervention had only partially prevented. The town faced destruction that would take years to repair, if repair proved possible. And somewhere in the upside down, Vecna healed, planning his next attempt, patient now because the gates stood open and time favoured his eventual triumph. The official explanation satisfied those who needed simple answers. A previously unknown fault line had shifted, causing unprecedented seismic activity in a region where earthquakes shouldn't occur. Geologists appeared on local news expressing surprise, but offering technical explanations involving tectonic stress and statistical anomalies. The National Guard arrived to assist with rescue operations and maintain order. FEMA established disaster relief centres throughout Hawkins, processing claims and distributing emergency supplies to families who'd lost homes. The earthquake cover story failed to account for details that troubled residents willing to examine evidence critically. The fissures that split Hawkins followed two precise paths, intersecting at the town centre in pattern suggesting design rather than natural geological movement. The destruction was too selective, some areas devastated while adjacent blocks remained untouched. Most disturbing, the fissures glowed faintly at night with bioluminescent quality that geology textbooks didn't explain. The upside down was bleeding through into Hawkins, along the gate's paths, dimensional boundaries eroding where Vecna's ritual had torn reality. Organic matter from that dark dimension grew along the fissure's edges, vines and fungal masses spreading slowly but visibly from the tears. Wildlife avoided these contaminated zones, their instincts recognizing wrongness that humans rationalized away. The air above the gates shimmered with heat distortion effects, except the temperature read cold, particles from another dimension mixing with Earth's atmosphere. Refugee camps appeared in and around Hawkins as families evacuated damaged homes or areas too close to the growing contamination. The high school gymnasium became emergency shelter housing dozens. Churches opened their fellowship halls to displaced families. Wealthier residents fled entirely, relocating to Indianapolis or other cities where normalcy still existed. Those who remained fell into two categories: people with nowhere else to go and people determined to fight for their town, despite evidence suggesting Hawkins might be beyond saving. The community fractured along ideological lines that the crisis had exposed but not created. Jason Carver's followers, numbering in the dozens even after the earthquake, should have revealed the inadequacy of their satanic panic explanations, maintained that Eddie Munson had caused the disaster through occult rituals. They pointed to his death in unclear circumstances, to the timing of the earthquake coinciding with his final hours, to anything that confirmed beliefs they needed to sustain their worldview. The fact that Eddie had died heroically, that he'd sacrificed himself to protect a town that hated him, remained unknown and would have been dismissed as lies by those invested in his monstrosity. Government response involved more than disaster relief. Military personnel in unmarked vehicles patrolled the perimeter of the contaminated zones, restricting access and conducting operations whose nature remained classified. Dr. Owens coordinated with officials whose names never appeared on public documents, managing information and containing exposure of truths that would create national panic if widely known. He protected the group who'd fought Vecna, ensuring their involvement stayed buried in classified reports that few possessed clearance to read. Hopper resumed his position as chief of police through arrangements Owens facilitated, his survival explained through a cover story about undercover operations that couldn't be discussed for security reasons. His return provided stability and leadership during crisis, his experience with Hawkins' hidden threats making him uniquely qualified to manage the visible disaster. He coordinated with the military presence, translating between federal authorities who knew the truth and local officials who accepted comfortable lies. Max remained comatose in Hawkins Hospital, her body healing from physical trauma while her consciousness existed somewhere Elle couldn't reach. Lucas visited daily, reading to her, playing music, maintaining faith that she would return. Elle tried repeatedly to contact Max, psychically, to find her friend's mind and guide it back to wakefulness, but Max seemed absent from her own body, hidden in psychological space that Vecna's attack had damaged beyond Elle's ability to repair. The town persisted through April, its population reduced but its remaining residents demonstrating resilience, born from stubbornness and nowhere else to go. Schools remained closed, businesses operated sporadically, life continued in diminished form, waiting for resolution that seemed perpetually deferred. And along the gates, the contamination spread incrementally, the upside down claiming Earth slowly but inexorably, patient as the monster who'd opened these wounds and who waited in darkness for opportunity to finish what he'd begun. And so our journey through time concludes where it began, with a small Indiana town hiding extraordinary secrets beneath its ordinary surface. The story continues, each day adding new moments to a history that began with ancient peoples and limestone caves, that grew through settlements and laboratories, that exploded into dimensional warfare and teenage heroism. Each child who rode bikes through those neighborhoods, each scientist who pursued forbidden knowledge, each parent who fought to protect their family, all writing their own chapters in the never-ending story of Hawkins. The gates remain open. Vecna waits in darkness. Max sleeps in her hospital bed while friends maintain vigil. The upside down spreads slowly through a town that refuses to surrender, despite evidence suggesting surrender might be wisdom. But for tonight, their battles are paused, their courage remembered, their sacrifices honoured. Sweet dreams, dear listener. May your sleep be filled with brave friends, fierce loyalty, and the gentle certainty that even when darkness seems overwhelming, ordinary people discover extraordinary strength. The story continues, but rest is earned. Sleep well.